for Hall to present the science behind how migration corridors are defined, and then following that, then Doug Bridmeyer and Andy Bruce will give a little more update on the department and how the department's use of those corridors and a fourth quarter oil and gas lease sale. So with further ado, Mr. Sawyer.
Good afternoon, Hall.
How are you guys doing?
If you could just, I know who you work for, but if you could just give us a whole.
Sure. My name's Hall Sawyer. I'm a research biologist with Western Ecosystem Technology. We're a Wyoming-based consulting firm. I've been working on big game in Wyoming since 1994. I started working on elk and the bighorns as my graduate work, and worked with the University of Wyoming for 7 or 8 years after that, and I've been with West doing big game research for the last 16 years or so. So that's kind of the deal. And actually, we're going to start with the energy talk. Please.
Maybe we can talk a little later. You're doing that study over on those windmills too.
That's true.
I don't know if we got time for that today too, but that.
Yeah, we have a handful of studies going on related to energy, including wind, solar, and oil and gas. So we have the trifecta going right now. But I guess the first thing I want to talk about today was this paper that co-authors and I, Nicole Corfanta, Ryan Nielsen, Kevin Monteith, and Dale Strickland put together, which essentially marks the end of nearly 20 years of mule deer and energy research that we've been doing over on the Pinedale Anticline in western Wyoming. Now, it's hard to believe that this work started over 20 years ago in 1997 as a collaborative effort with the department and industry. And I think it's helpful to kind of take yourself back to 1997, because things were a lot different there. From a biological perspective, at the time, our mule deer herds were so large and so productive, it just seemed impossible or inconceivable that human impacts or energy development might cause declines that they couldn't quickly recover from, or that harvest might become difficult, or things like that. It just wasn't in our thought process. And relatedly, our open spaces and sagebrush basins were so immense that they too seemed almost immune or invincible to human development or any sort of impacts from energy development. And I guess looking back on that time nearly 20 years ago, those perceptions seem a little bit naive, but I think that's just largely due to our inexperience with large-scale energy development. This was a time in the mid-90s when the gas boom was just beginning, and we just had no sense of how this would transform our Wyoming landscape, especially in the Powder River, Green River, Great Divide basins. So needless to say, in the mid-90s, we really didn't have very good knowledge of how this might impact our big game herds. Well, this began to change in the early 2000s when researchers from around North America began to come out with studies that showed how big game respond to energy development. And this actually included some of our early work in Pinedale as well, where we were fortunate enough to have mule deer data before development and data after development, and we were able to clearly show that mule deer avoided well pads, which was consistent with this growing body of literature. But despite that growing body of literature, there remained a common perception that big game just quickly habituate to energy development once it's in the production phase. And this narrative is especially common in our NEPA documents, our environmental impact statements, environmental assessments, categorical exclusions. And just to give you an example, this is pretty common language. Following drilling and well completion operations, noise levels will be reduced. And as a result, species might acclimate to well pads, use habitats immediately adjacent. This has been observed at natural gas production sites in Wyoming. And although this habituation narrative is common and pervasive, it's not supported by any science. And that's unfortunate because it's these NEPA documents that the public relies on to identify and disclose any potential impacts associated with development on federal lands. So, armed with nearly 20 years of data, we set out to really tackle this question or perception of habituation. And it's a really important one because if animals do habituate, then we're just talking about short-term changes in behavior that aren't likely to have any fitness consequences. But on the other hand, if these animals take years to habituate or don't habituate, then all of a sudden this is a different deal. We're talking now about long-term changes in behavior that would likely have fitness consequences. And this is especially true in regions where habitats are really restricted, like our big game winter ranges that are geographically restricted. So just a little bit of study background. Since 1998, we collected over 1 million locations from nearly 500 deer. For this specific study, we used 260,000 locations collected from just about under 200 deer. We had 2 years of pre-development data. We had 15 years of development phase data. I think most everyone here is familiar with the Pinedale Anticline area. Our study area was the northern third of the anticline. And just as a reminder, all these deer out here are migratory. They migrate to Gros Ventre Salt Range, Snake River Range, Wyoming Range. And so any sort of impacts in the gas field aren't just localized. They are seen across this broader migratory landscape. Give you a sense of what the development build-out pattern looked like. When we began this study, there was hardly any development up there, just a few exploratory wells and access roads. But that all changed in 2000 when the BLM approved 700 well pads and 400 miles of road. And then later in 2008, supplemental EIS approved another 4,400 wells. So the objectives of our study were really pretty simple. We just wanted to figure out whether mule deer habituated to disturbance through time. And then concurrently, we also wanted to measure mule deer abundance so that we had some sort of indirect link between any behavioral changes that we might see and demography. So our methods were really pretty simple. We took those 260,000 locations and we measured distance to well pad for each animal. And then we calculated distance to well pad each year using animal as the experimental unit. And we can come up with some graphs that look like this. This is distance to well pad in the gray area. These are our pre-development data. So if deer do not avoid well pads, we would expect these numbers to bounce around down here. If they avoid well pads, we'd expect them to be elevated. And then if they habituate, they should go back down to pre-development levels. These are what the long-term data look like, and you can see mule deer consistently used areas further from well pads than they did before development. These patterns are a little bit easier to see if we collapse the data into just 3 groups where we have before development. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Mr. Sawyer. They're having technical problems. I'd like other people on the internet to watch us. Can we break for about 10 minutes? And
Fine with me.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but this is very important. I'd like everybody on the internet to watch us too.
Okay.
It's better than Discovery Channel, yeah. Because of the internet problems, we're going to have Dr. Sawyer start from the beginning. So it's broadcast from the get-go. I appreciate your patience, Dr. Sawyer. Thank you.
All right, well, take two. Again, here to talk about this paper we completed last year with my co-authors, Nicole Corfanta, Ryan Nielsen, Kevin Monteith, Dale Strickland. This work wraps up nearly 20 years of mule deer and energy research that we've been doing over in the Pinedale Anticline in western Wyoming. This work started over 20 years ago. 1997, things were a lot different. I think it helps to kind of think about where you were at that time, because from a biology perspective, things were different as well. Our mule deer herds were so large, so productive, that it really just seemed sort of inconceivable or impossible that human development or energy development might impact these deer herds where they would decline and they couldn't recover, or harvest would become difficult. And relatedly, with our open spaces and our sagebrush basins, they seem so immense that they almost seemed immune or invincible to human disturbances or energy development as well. And I think in hindsight, these perceptions, I acknowledge, are naive, but I think that naivety was because of our just inexperience with large-scale energy development. The mid-90s was when the gas boom was just beginning, and we really had no idea how this was about to transform the landscapes in Wyoming, especially in the Powder River, Green River, Great Divide basins. And so at this point in time, we really didn't have a lot of knowledge about how energy development might impact big game. But this began to change in the early 2000s when studies from around Western North America began to document how big game respond to energy development. This included our own work in Pinedale, where we were fortunate enough to have mule deer information distribution data prior to development and after development. So we were able to show a clear response, a clear avoidance response to well pads, which was consistent with this growing body of literature. But despite this growing body of literature, there remained this common perception, which continues today, by the way, that big game can just quickly acclimate or habituate to energy development once it's in the production phase. And this narrative is really common in our NEPA documents, our environmental impact statements, environmental assessments, categorical exclusions. Here's a quick example, which you can find many just like this. It says, following drilling and well completion, noise levels will be reduced. As a result, species might acclimate to well pads and use habitats immediately adjacent. This has been observed at other gas production sites in Wyoming. Now, although this narrative is pervasive and common, it's not supported by any science. And that's unfortunate, because it's these NEPA documents that the public really relies on to identify and disclose potential impacts associated with development on federal lands. So, armed with nearly 20 years of data, we went out to tackle this idea of habituation, and it's a really important one, because on one hand, if animals do habituate, then we're just talking about short-term changes in behavior that aren't likely to carry any fitness consequences. If, on the other hand, they might take several years or don't habituate, well, that's a different ballgame. Then all of a sudden we're talking about long-term changes in behavior that could affect fitness. Now, just a little bit of study background. We collected over 1 million locations from nearly 500 deer since 1998. For this particular study, we used 260,000 locations from just under 200 mule deer. And we had a 2-year pre-development phase and 15-year development phase. I think most of you are familiar with the anticline. Our study area was the northern third of the anticline, And just to remind everybody, mule deer that winter on this area known as the Mesa are all migratory. They migrate to 4 different mountain ranges in northwest Wyoming, and so any sort of impacts we see in the gas field are not localized. Rather, they're seen across this broader migratory landscape. Here's a figure depicting the build-out or footprint of energy development. When we began this work, there was just a few access roads and exploratory wells. That changed in 2000 when the BLM approved 700 well pads and 400 miles of road. And then that was followed up in 2008 with a supplemental record of decision that approved 4,400 wells. So the objectives were really pretty simple. We just wanted to see whether mule deer habituated to disturbance through time. But importantly, we also wanted to measure mule deer abundance so that we had some sort of indirect link to demography if indeed we observed any changes in behavior. So our methods were really pretty simple. We took those 260,000 locations and we measured distance to well pad for each deer. We then calculated distance to well pad for each year using the animal as the experimental unit. So we could come up with a graph that looks something like this, where the shaded area is pre-development. And again, if mule deer do not respond, we'd expect those numbers to bounce around down here. If they avoid development, we'd expect them to be elevated. But then if they habituate, they should come back down to those pre-development levels. Well, this is what we observed through 15 years, and you can see nearly all those years were elevated, suggesting no acclimation or habituation. Now to pick up where we were 15 minutes ago, an easier way to look at this is to collapse all these data just into one graph where we have before development, during development, and then the last 3 years of development. And the reason we use the last 3 years of development, if there was ever a time that animals were going to habituate, it would be the last few years of the study. And what we found was during development, deer were 900 meters further from well pads than before development. And the last 3 years of development, they were actually 1.3 kilometers further from development. So not only did we not find any evidence of habituation, mule deer actually are using habitats further from development as time progresses. Now, long-term avoidance behavior is a concern to managers because essentially X amount of winter range supports X number of deer. And so if we have a winter range here in green and we throw down some well pads, the footprint or surface disturbance from these pads really doesn't add up to a whole lot. Might not be that big of a deal. But when we throw this avoidance behavior around it, all of a sudden we've lost a big chunk of our winter range. And so this avoidance behavior effectively reduces the size of the winter range. And so absent any sort of habitat improvements that could offset these losses, you would expect this population to decline. And that is, in fact, what we saw. In the first year of development, we had about 5,200 deer out there. In the last year's study, we had about 3,000. It's a 42% decline in deer numbers. If you want a little more conservative way of looking at those data, you can fit a regression line, and if that is a 36% decline. Either way you cut it, there's a lot fewer deer now than there was before development. And I want to point out too that this study ended after a series of mild winters. So this was the best scenario we've seen since 2000. As you might recall, the winter of 16-17 was probably the toughest winter the Green River Basin has seen in 50 years or so. We lost 35% of our adults, and we lost essentially an entire fawn crop. So none of that is reflected here. All right. Well, obviously these results weren't consistent with the common political narrative that we can balance energy and wildlife, and that can be a tough pill to swallow in a state like Wyoming, where we rely so heavily on the energy sector. So we have had a lot of pushback, and there's been other narratives to distract or discredit this work. One of the real common narratives is you guys don't know what you're talking about. The deer just went somewhere else. Well, we had these deer collared for 17 years, so we actually do know where they went. And in that 17 years, with the hundreds of deer we captured, 3 of them changed winter ranges. So the deer did not just go somewhere else. Another narrative we hear a lot is, well, obviously the deer decline, they're declining everywhere, but it doesn't have anything to do with oil and gas development. And that's true. Deer are declining across their range, but it varies a lot regionally and locally. And within western Wyoming, the sublet herd, for example, only declined 16% during this same time period. And that includes our study area. So there's just no evidence at all that mule deer have declined at the rates in western Wyoming that we observed in the gas field. The game and fish gets blamed a lot too, as always. Of course, you guys saw declining deer numbers because the game and fish kills too many deer. It doesn't have anything to do with oil and gas. Well, over our study period, the game and fish has cut harvest in half. So not only are they not killing too many deer, there's actually fewer hunting opportunities and 45% less harvest. And then another thing we hear a lot too is, man, you guys just could have avoided this whole thing if you'd just have done some sort of mitigation. Why didn't you just mitigate? Well, the mitigation measures that the operators and industry implemented in Pinedale were probably some of the most expensive and elaborate mitigation efforts that we've seen in the state to minimize direct surface disturbance. There was multiple wells drilled from single pads. This is an example of where 54 wells were drilled off of those 2 pads. So you see what the footprint would have looked like if they were single pads versus drilling those off of just 1 pad. This approach reduced direct habitat loss by 80% out there. Then to reduce human activity, which a lot of the avoidance behaviors caused from, liquid gathering systems were installed. This essentially allows operators to pipe off all those byproducts and condensate to eliminate all the truck traffic. And this was a big deal. This eliminates tens of thousands of vehicle trips per year and a lot of disturbance to mule deer. So the point being, the impacts that we're talking about today were with these pretty aggressive mitigation measures in place. So just to conclude, our study refutes this notion that mule deer habituate to producing well pads. And it highlights that these behavioral effects of energy development are long-term. And when they're long-term, they can affect population abundance by displacing animals, which reduces the amount of available habitat. And this is especially true on these winter ranges that are geographically limited. We can't just make more winter range. And then finally, I think it's a good reminder that regardless of how good our on-site mitigation efforts are, mitigation can reduce impacts, but not eliminate impacts. And that is the summary of the mule deer and energy work. I think the plan was we would take some questions here if we had it and then move on to the migration talk, but whatever your preference is.
Yeah, that was item 10 on the agenda, and that's thank you, Dr. Sawyer. That gave us the science behind the migration corridors. Would anybody like to speak to that?
Mr. President, Mayor?
Yes, sir.
Doc, what do you think the depredation rate was on that?
Depredation?
Yes, I mean, what was on the decline of the herd, on the declining of the herd? Do you, what kind of a role did the mountain lion or coyotes or
Oh, sure.
what did they play on that?
So the role of predation in this decline, well, I think it's really pretty minimal. I'm not sure we ever documented a predation kill on the winter range. This winter range is down in the open sagebrush where we don't have cougars. We do have coyotes, but they're usually not a problem except with
So pretty nominal. I mean,
yeah, pretty nominal. And I mean, the thing with predation again is that mule deer and the sublet herd outside the gas field are exposed to the same predation pressures that these mule deer are on. Yet these are the ones that
are declining, and the other ones aren't.
right, not at this same rate.
Mr. President,
Yes, sir.
Mr. Sawyer, what were the overall deer populations in the 90s and 2000s when you were doing this study?
What were they?
The overall,
Well, I don't have numbers for the state off the top of my head, but for those of you that have been around since the early 90s was what we referred to as the deer wars over in western Wyoming, where in the late 80s and early 90s deer were kind of at all-time highs, and the department got, I don't know how to characterize this, in trouble for harvesting more deer than the people thought were needed. So we had a little bit of a decline, but then in the mid-90s, after the deer wars, those populations really recovered well and were arguably as healthy as they've been as we entered the 2000s.
and the reason I asked that is because I tried to do a little research on this, and what I could find is that during the 90s, kind of an average overall population in the area was about roughly pushing 40,000 animals. Does that seem realistic?
Yeah, based on those estimates, yeah.
70s and 80s, I think I've read histories of 50 to 60,000 mule deer in that part of the state. And I was just curious how that number came from 50 to 60,000 to, by the 90s, of roughly 40,000. What happened to those deer before all this development started?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and it's a good question. I'm not sure I have an answer for. I mean, we talk about, when we look at all the factors that impact mule deer populations between harvest, residential and energy development, and then you also get these fire suppression, fire regimes that are changing our shrub communities, where all of a sudden in the 80s and 90s too, that's when our elk populations really start to blow up. At the same time, our deer populations start to go down. So I don't think there's any one thing we can point to, but a combination of those factors started turning the favor toward elk and against mule deer.
So based on what we're seeing here with your study, the last part of your study during the last couple of years, if I understood you correctly, those mule deer even getting further away from any production. So is there ever a chance of getting back to 50,000 mule deer?
No, I don't think so. No, I don't think so. But I mean, there are Kevin Monteith and his group at university are doing additional work in this same area, trying to figure out a little bit of what you're getting at. What's the mechanism? How do we go from 5,000 deer to 3,000 deer? Is it in reduced fawn survival? Is it predation, or what is it? And what their work shows is that it's about this nutrition, and that these females, it's all with nutrition. When these females can't recruit fawns like they used to, things just get ratcheted down. And what Kevin's work shows is that there actually is some good forage close to these well pads, but it's just not getting utilized by the mule deer.
Right.
So there's some good forage out there, but they just don't want to be close to.
But is that because we're at 30,000 deer overall population instead of 50? If there were 50,000 deer there, they might encroach on those well pads and utilize that forage, but maybe they just don't have to right now.
Yeah, well, that I guess that's not what we would predict. I mean, if we start with 5,000 deer and we have less habitat because they're avoiding these areas, if that's true, they should overcome that perceived risk and go feed in those areas, but they just don't.
They just don't. Okay. Okay, thanks.
You know, may I, Mr. President?
Yeah.
Dr. Hall, oil and gas development always seems to be the first thing that we point at when things are declining, when other, I didn't know that, Mike. There was 50,000 head of deer down there at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't point the decline to oil and gas on that. It's just simply down. But now we're in business to promote growth.
Right.
And so, first of all, I want you to know I'm an advocate for a higher deer population or a sustainable deer population.
Mm-hmm.
So however we achieve that is I'm all for. But I just hate to see development take the bad rap on everything, it seems like. And is there other elements involved here that we don't know yet?
Well, I mean, yeah, and when we're talking about 50,000 to 30,000, I'm not here putting that on industry. I'm talking about mule deer on one segment of the sublet deer herd that went from 5,000 to 3,000. That's all I'm talking about. I'm not putting the rest of that on industry. So,
Okay.
yeah, no, there's a lot of other factors at play here besides oil and gas development. But again, you know, this specific project was tasked with one of the most productive and notable winter ranges the state had to offer in terms of trophy deer and deer densities. And the department had the foresight 20 years ago to say, woo, we're not sure what's going to happen here. Let's put a long-term study in place. And compared to other parts in western Wyoming, this deer population has declined at a much higher rate than surrounding areas where we don't have oil and gas development. So, you know, that's all we're saying.
Well, and the work has to go on. I mean, we have to find a solution, I guess, and that's good.
Mr. President.
Mr. Crank.
So first question, has development of the anticline ceased? I mean, my understanding is they're still drilling new wells out there and still continuing to develop that area.
Yeah, no, it continues. And I don't have a estimate on, you know, I guess my experience anyways with most of these fields is there's never really an end date. There's always some sort of new technology or new something that allows those fields to be revitalized or that infrastructure to be utilized. And so, yeah, the natural gas continues to get drilled in the anticline, and I don't know if or when that is going to fade out.
I mean, your distance from well pads, what appeared to me from your graphs to be greatest in the 12, 13, 14, 15 time frame?
Yeah, well, and some of that, what I didn't show here, but it's in the paper that you all have, is that you see some of the interannual fluctuations where some years are closer to well pads, some years are further away. What explains a lot of that is winter severity. And so in these mild winters, when that country's open, these deer are in better body condition, they have the luxury to say, I don't want to be close to those well pads. Right. But as Commissioner Schmidt was saying, in these tough winters, when they're in poor body condition, that's when they say, the heck with the noise and the light. I'm going to go sit by, I'm going to go eat. And so you'll see in the paper, we break it out by severe, moderate, and severe, average, and mild winters, and there's a nice linear relationship there to how close these animals get. And that's, I guess, another cautionary note for some of these studies. If we'd had only done this study, say, for 2 years, and they would have been 2 tough winters, we'd have said, oh, these deer don't avoid well pads at all. But with that long-term data set, we're able to pick those patterns out that we otherwise wouldn't have been able to.
Second question, I mean, we lost 42% of the deer on the Pinedale Anticline during your study period, and we only lost 16% of our deer in the sublet herd unit.
Yep.
Can you give us an idea, I mean, how big is the sublet herd unit? What are we talking about? It's in your paper, but
Yeah. Scott, do you have a good call on the current sublet number? I want to say 35,000 maybe, in that ballpark.
No, I'm not talking deer numbers.
Oh.
Geographical size.
Oh. Geez. Well, the Green River Basin.
I mean, a huge area we
Yeah.
lost. I'm just trying to get a feel for this. In an overall huge area where we were looking at deer numbers, we lost 16%.
Yeah.
But in this smaller area, we lost 42%.
Correct.
Seems like a pretty good statistical correlation that oil and gas development can dramatically affect mule deer numbers.
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, when you look at that build out and that footprint, and you combine that with this avoidance behavior, there's just less winter range available. So it shouldn't be a big surprise that that area supports fewer number of deer now than it did before. But those impacts likely would have been a lot worse if we wouldn't have had those aggressive mitigation measures as well.
I'd like that paper to be part of the record. I don't know how you put it with the minutes or this paper by Dr. Sawyer.
Could attach it to the minutes, but I think it's out there. You published it, what, a year ago?
Yep.
Yeah, we'll put it in the minutes, please. Is there any questions from the public about this item number 10? Please. All right. Any other questions from the commission?
Yeah, Mr. President.
Go ahead, Ms. Bird.
Both,
Wait a second, Ms. Bird is.
with both of these deer herds that you're talking about, do they both migrate? Studying them down that migration compared to the bigger herd that showed less decline. Do they migrate as well?
Yeah, almost all the deer in western Wyoming are migratory. It's rare that we can find resident deer, aside from our town deer,
Okay.
the ones living in town. But all our big herds are
Yes, you got the
migratory.
sublet herd and then you got the Wyoming range herd, is that? You got the ones over closer to the west, the Wyoming range herd, then the sublet herd's right there above Pinedale and goes down through the Red Desert.
It's just a whole different deal. In our country, they just stay around. I mean,
Right.
they move around a little, but not these major migrations, so there's different behavior.
Yep.
'Cause they do just acclimate.
Yep.
And they lay in the shade of the oil tanks and lay along the roads and are not concerned.
Yep, and we actually get some of that because you can drive out on the anticline too, and you can see deer doing that. And that's another, criticism we've got. People say, geez, you don't know what you're talking about. I drive out there, I see deer sitting on the well pad anytime. And what we try to say is, that's the difference between anecdote and science, because for every deer you might see, there's 10 others that are doing something else. And for that deer you see when you're driving by in your truck, you don't know what that deer is doing the other 23 hours of the day, much less the other 364 days of the year. And so that's where these GPS studies help us separate some of that out. But you can see some of that behavior. It's the exception, not the rule in Pinedale.
Right. Thank you.
Now maybe I'm confused. I mean, the sublet deer herd that you're referring to and the Wyoming range deer herd, are those both located within what we call the sublet management unit that were,
They're different herds. So the Wyoming Range herd is to the south and to the west. The sublet is more to the south and the east. So
okay. Thank you.
One more question I've got for Paul.
Yeah.
With, you know, we end up around 30,000 mule deer and we can maintain that number. Do the young that they produce year after year after year, are they, what am I trying to say?
are they following sort of the behavior of their mothers or
Exactly.
what? Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, because this is a 17-year study. So, you know, the deer in the early years of this study, this was a novel disturbance to them. I mean, they'd never seen anything like this. But the deer for probably the last 7-8 years of this study were deer that were born into this environment. Right. The first time they came out of the Grovant or the Hoback back to the Mesa, that's the only winter range they knew was with that development on there. Yet they still show that avoidance behavior. And so that avoidance behavior is not, it seems to pass along generationally, even if those deer have been exposed to it, which was really surprising.
Excuse me, you mentioned, Dr. Hall, that the overall deer population is kind of declining to begin with. And I see it in the Bighorn Basin.
Oh, yeah.
And I hear it a lot from folks that I know and folks that want to express their opinion and their concerns. So, I mean, we don't have any oil and gas development up there.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's why I bring this question up. Is it directly correlated with oil and gas development? Do we know that 100%? Or is it just a phase we're going through? Because the Bighorn Basin is in decline, and that's a fact.
If I could answer that. I think that one graph you showed, the herd has declined 16%, but the ones in this that go over the Mesa declined 32%. So yes, we got a 16% regular decline, but then that other one decreased 32%, if I remember my numbers.
Yeah, and that's right. But I mean, you're right. Mule deer are declining across their range, not just unique to the Bighorns or sublet. I mean, they're generally declining across the West, but it varies regionally and locally. But the strength that we have to infer that most of this is due to oil and gas in this particular case is the fact that these deer declined by 40%. The larger sublet herd unit, which they're a part of, declined by 16% at the same time. And the rest of that herd unit is relatively unaffected by oil and gas development compared to there.
Mr. Dobrik?
I'll pass. I'll wait till later.
Any other comments before we proceed to number 11? Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. Have a drink.
All right, we'll shift gears to another non-controversial topic of migration corridors. Okay. Well, as I think most of you are aware, there's been a lot of new recent technology and science advances that really have improved our understanding of migration ecology, which has also improved our ability to map these migrations across large and complex landscapes. Now, these advances have certainly generated a lot of interest from the public and other stakeholders, but it's also generated a lot of new opportunities to actually integrate or at least consider migration in management and land use planning at local, state, and even federal levels. And so that's what I'd like to talk about next, is essentially go through the fundamentals of how we go about delineating or characterizing migration corridors for big game, which can then go on to help inform management and policy. So with these migration talks, I think it's always good to just remind ourselves first why so much attention is given to migration. And the answer is really pretty simple. It's because migration promotes abundance. And so it doesn't matter what state we're in, whether we're in New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, our largest and most productive deer herds are migratory. And so it makes sense that to sustain those deer herds, their migration routes need to remain intact and functional. So nowadays, armed with GPS data, we're able to reveal those migratory patterns relatively quickly. Here's a mule deer over in western Wyoming. Collects locations every 2 hours. And simply by connecting the dots, we can see exactly when, where, how that animal moves across the landscape. And this is awesome information for managers. And by simply connecting the dots, we can actually learn a lot about these animals. For example, here's an interstate mule deer herd between Wyoming and Colorado. Each color represents a different deer. The solid lines are their spring migration, and the dashed lines are their fall migration. So just from this map, you can see that mule deer use the same route in the spring as they do in the fall. We follow these same individuals out for one more year, and now we can see that not only do they use the same route in the spring and the fall, but they actually use the same route year after year. Now this is really valuable information to know from a management or conservation perspective, because we can be assured that any sort of investment put into these migration routes will benefit these deer long term, whether it's a habitat improvement, a conservation easement, some sort of lease deferral or stipulation. These animals use these year after year and season after season. Another nice application of just mapping line data is to illustrate the jurisdictional complexity that's so common with these migrations, not just in Wyoming, but across the Intermountain West, where these animals have to move across a mix of private lands and state lands and federal lands and everything else in between. And we can just take a cross-section of those lines and with this ribbon map basically see the composition of landowners. And so this is a great way to identify what stakeholders need to be at the table when we start talking about management or conservation of a particular migratory herd. But it also shows you which stakeholders have most skin in the game. You see these big chunks of BLM. BLM manages 70% of this migration, but you also see all those white slivers. Those are private landowners. This migration crosses 41 different private landowners. So when we talk about migration, so often we're talking about ways of protecting or conserving, and I think that's probably appropriate in most places, but these simple maps too provide us with opportunities to actually restore migration. So most big game movements and migrations along the I-80 corridor are actually blocked by the interstate. So simple maps like this can help tell us where underpasses or overpasses might be constructed to make that roadway permeable and to provide more migratory options for these deer, elk, and even pronghorn herds. So connecting the dots, this is all great stuff and has a lot of utility, but it also has some pretty serious limitations. And the first and most obvious is there's no area associated with a line. So we don't know if these routes are a meter wide or a kilometer wide or what. And we're also not just dealing with one line. We collect data for multiple years from the same animal. So here's this animal's fall migration. Here comes its second spring migration. Here comes its second fall migration. And we don't just have one animal. Here's animal number 2 with a bunch of migrations. Animal number 3, animal number 4, and heck, we may have 50 animals. And what becomes obvious pretty quick is that with these sort of maps, there's no way to combine these to make population level inference. And the Game and Fish and BLM and other managers, they don't care about the migration routes of just one or two animals. They want to be able to make decisions about an entire herd or an entire population. And the other obvious thing about these maps is that there's really no information on where do these animals spend the most time, or among all this mess of spaghetti lines, which of these routes are used by the most animals. So that's where this whole migration mapping business comes in, and there's a new statistical technique called the Brownian Bridge Movement Model. We won't get into that, but the utility of this new statistical tool is that we can take this mule deer example, and what it will do is it will provide us not only with the width of the route, but also intensity of use within the route. So there's that animal's spring migration. Here's its fall migration. Here's its spring migration, second one, and then second fall migration. Now what's great about this approach is we don't want to deal with 4 migrations from one animal, so we can just average all of these together, and voila, we have a nice map that illustrates all the migration data from this one animal. And probably one of the first things you'll notice about these Brownian bridges is that some of the parts of the route are used more intensively than others. We can actually extract those relatively easy in blue. We call those stopover sites. And stopover sites are important for mule deer and big game. You've probably heard folks at the University of Wyoming talk about how important this is for green wave surfing. And that's essentially how these mule deer track the spring green up, so they can access the most nutritional forage as the vegetation greens up. And it's also, I think, solidified this idea that we should think about migration as habitat. So just like winter range and just like summer range, these migration corridors are an important part of the annual nutritional cycle of our big game herds. Mule deer specifically spend 95% of their time in stopovers. That's a big deal when you think about a lot of our biggest herds are spending 3 months out of the year migrating. And like the migration routes, these stopovers too are used year after year. So these stopover sites have become a conservation or management priority. Now, of course, we don't just want to do this with one deer. We want to do it with an entire population. So these are all the deer off the Mesa Winter Range, which is the area we did the energy development talk before. So 271 migrations, 81 animals. Here's what the lines look like. Here's what our population level migration looks like. That's the intensity of use heat map. We can pull out the highest values there in yellow, and there's our stopover habitat for that herd. Now, this is all great information to be able to map stopover habitat, but one critical challenge remains, and that is when you have all this mess of routes and lines radiating from a common winter range, how do you figure out how to prioritize or which ones are most important? And we can actually do that by taking just one extra step and looking at the footprint of that migration corridor. And if we forget about intensity of use for a minute and just think about these footprints, every animal here, so we had 81 animals, has a footprint or a contour. And we can just keep stacking those up and basically calculate, well, where most of these animals are traveling. So we can end up with a nice clean map that looks like this. These are high, moderate, and low use corridors. And the analogy I like to use here is one of roads, where we might consider the lighter colored areas like our county roads in terms of traffic. The medium blue areas might be like our state highways, where they get pretty good travel, but the dark blue vein there, that's our mule deer interstate. That's the area that should be at the top of the list for management and priority concerns. So now all of a sudden we're filling up our management toolbox with all these nice new tools that weren't available just a few years ago. We can delineate stopover habitat for populations, and we can identify high, moderate, and low use corridors for entire populations. These tools can be used independently or together, however users see fit. I thought it might be helpful here to show what the game and fish corridor definition looks like relative to what I've been showing you here. So here's the full corridor with high, moderate, low use type stuff colored out. And the game and fish corridor looks like this in red. And it doesn't include the full extent because the game and fish definition says corridors have to be used by 2 or more animals. And that's fine, but it has created a little bit of confusion because some people have come and said, man, these methods are messed up. You can't have a non-contiguous corridor. And my response has been, you know, the corridor is contiguous. When we get these little breakups, that's just an artifact of how the department has defined the corridor. Whenever you say it's going to just be 2 or more, 3 or more, 4 or more, then you're going to start getting little islands and pieces that break up. And this is true too to a lesser extent with the stopover habitat. You can see that the vast majority of stopover habitat is included in the game and fish definition. But you will get some little tiny pockets of stopover habitat that are outside that. And so, again, people have said, you know, something's wrong here. You can't have stopover habitat that's outside the game and fish corridor. And this is why that question sometimes arises. So I wanted to sort of wrap up here by talking a little bit about whether we should have confidence in these mapping tools, because I've heard people say, you know, you can't, how can you map a migration corridor for a herd that might have 5,000 animals when you only mark 50 animals? Can you really do that? And the short answer is, yeah, we can. There's something called the central limit theorem, which is the foundation of statistics and sampling that allows us to do that. But without getting down into the statistical weeds, I think most people say, yeah, okay, that's cool, but what sample size do we need to be confident? And the problem is with this that the real answer is, well, it depends. But in most cases, 35 to 40 animals seem to be adequate. Now, just to illustrate rather than explain to you, I think it's easier to illustrate why in some cases we might need fewer animals and in some cases we might need more animals. It depends on how much variability is in that migratory population. So this is kind of like the red desert to Hoback, where there's just a few routes projecting from that winter range. And this is a scenario where, heck, maybe we only need 20 animals would be fine. But you go to another area, winter range, where you have a whole bunch of migration routes going in all different directions. Well, then all of a sudden, maybe we need 50 or 60 collars. And so that's the gradient we're talking about. That's why the answer on sample size is it depends. But as a general rule of thumb, most of our populations tend to fall in the middle of this gradient somewhere. And so 35 to 40 animals is a reasonable starting point. Another way to show that we have confidence in these methods is for almost every study, especially for the corridors, most of the corridors, Atlantic Rim, Sublet, Wyoming Range anyways, we've reached a point of diminishing returns. And by what I mean by that is these maps that I've shown you of stopover areas and high use areas, when we add more deer, it doesn't change the map. And if we look at these maps with 40 or 50 deer, you would have to squint to look at the difference between 80 deer. So that's just another way to feel comfortable about these data. But I also just might say, in the wildlife profession, I think without exception, we're exclusively working with imperfect data. Whether it's how many deer are in the sublet herd unit, how many elk are here, what's the disease prevalence, what's the survival rate, how many hunters, what's hunter success. These are all just estimates, imperfect data. But I think arguably among all these imperfect data sets that we're tasked to work with, that winter ranges, migration routes that are delineated from GPS data are probably some of the more accurate and reliable data that we have to work with. And I think that's evidenced by the fact that the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies basically hosted 4 workshops over the last 18 months specifically to discuss, evaluate, and train state and federal biologists on these methods that I just described to you. So we had over 262 state and federal agency attendees, and this tied in with the Secretarial Order 3362 and have really become a foundation or framework on informing winter range and migration delineation for programs associated with the Secretarial Order. So I guess the point here is that these migration maps and corridors aren't just something that a couple people in Wyoming are doing in the corner of the state. These are tools and techniques that have really been thoroughly evaluated and adopted by most Western states. And so I'll take you down to the Four Corners regions where we have interstate migrations between New Mexico and Colorado. Had no idea where those deer actually went. A couple years of GPS data. We convert those to migration sequences. We do Brownie and Bridge. We delineate stopover habitat. And then we identify high, moderate, and low use corridors. And now tribes on both sides here and BLM lands to the south are coordinating studies so that these types of data are effectively available for the entire Four Corners region. So anyways, I just wanted to end on a note where you can see what these data look like in another part of the world, because I get sick of looking at some of the Wyoming stuff, I think. That's all I have on migration.
Mr. President?
Yeah, Mr. Crank.
So Hall, I'm gonna whine just for a little bit. As a commissioner, I feel like we're getting kicked in the head from both sides on oil and gas leasing decisions. The environmental groups generally say we should request deferral of any lease that any way touches a migration corridor. The oil and gas guys say, this is all crazy, let us drill. Right. So how, this is a really hard question, but how do we better, how could the department and this commission make better decisions on what recommendations, that's all they are, recommendations, largely to the BLM with regard to oil and gas leasing? I mean, what additional work can be done? What else do we need to look at other than what we have today? I mean,
well,
what do we do?
Well, geez, I don't think I have the answer, but what I would say is that that management toolbox slide that I showed you for these areas where we have designated corridors, there's more information available than just a corridor. We have stopover habitat, we have high, moderate, and low use corridors, and we have winter range data. And so, if I were tasked at having to try to make some of these decisions, I would want all of those tools at my disposal. So when I'm looking at something, it's not just whether it's in a corridor or not. It's, is it in a high, medium, or low use corridor? Is it in a stopover area? Is it in a winter range? And just with those 4 tools available, that could provide, I think, more a better way to focus or target priorities rather than just looking at a corridor.
On your spaghetti maps, how do we know if there's a red line on that map? How do we know if that's two collared deer using that particular drainage or topographical feature?
Yep.
Or that's two collared deer in a herd of 1,000 that use that drainage or topographical feature?
Well, that's the problem with the spaghetti lines is we don't. But once we do that Browning Bridge, where we do the high, moderate, and low use, that's where those patterns are revealed. And we don't know the exact numbers, but it's all relative. And we can tell you there's a heck of a lot more animals on those interstates than they are on the county roads. Now, if you had which I don't think we probably have, if you knew exactly how many animals were in that particular winter range, you could back calculate and figure out, throw some rough estimates on how many animals are using what portion, but that sort of information is generally not available. It's more of a qualitative assessment in that here's the highways, here's the interstates, here's the county roads. Which ones do we want to target?
And I barely passed statistics in undergrad, so
Me too.
don't go there. Don't go there with me.
I'm just fooling you.
Don't go there with me, but I mean, these tools you're using are generally accepted in the scientific community, I assume, or you wouldn't be using them.
Right. And I mean, that's why I brought up the WAFWA training, is that there's been a lot of eyes on this, and we had 262 attendees, but actually 110 of those attendees took a half day just to train and talk and think about these techniques. And these are wildlife professionals working on the same issues we're working in all over the West. And, you know, at some point we may come up with a better tool, but right now this seems to be the best tool we have to describe and visualize these migration patterns.
If you were in the department shoes, so, I mean, we have, some of these areas might be 5 miles wide, some of them may be a mile. I mean, it seems to make sense. We have to protect stopover areas. We have to protect critical winter range. But these paths that they use to go between those, whether that needs to be protected for the health of the herd is going to be influenced by a variety of factors. The width of the corridor, the topography, so how do we decide how much surface disturbance, if any, can be can touch one of these migration corridors?
Yeah, no, it's a tough question, and I think again these are all just tools, and no matter how much data or tools we have, there's always going to be a level of subjectivity in these decisions. But I think having all those tools on the table allows you to make those subjective decisions informed, knowing, okay, does it overlap with stopover, even though it's a high use? Or maybe it's a high use, but it doesn't overlap with a stopover or winter range. You know, a high use area that overlaps with stopover and winter range is a lot more important than a high use that doesn't overlap with either of them. And, in terms of your second part of your question, how can we identify specific levels or thresholds of development? I think that's a sort of a field that, there's a lot of work to be done there. I have talked with the department about ways we could go back and revisit more of these Pinedale data to get a better sense of how mule deer migrate through the anticline, because we have mule deer on both sides of that development. Maybe we go back in time and we can reveal some patterns in terms of how much surface disturbance they're willing to handle and not. But I think most of those thresholds and levels of development are going to take some time to emerge. And I know Jared Merkel, he's a new associate professor at the University of Wyoming and is bringing on some grad students, and I know that's a topic that his lab will be looking at as well.
Mr.
Scott,
President,
do we have that Atlantic Rim map that we could show?
I think I have Atlantic. Here's Atlantic Rim right here.
It's got the one you showed me the other day. Am I saying it right? What?
That was the bag.
The bags corridor. Do we have that we can pull up and show?
Bags is based off of it in my print.
Yeah, this should be it.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry.
That's not the map you showed me though. You had, I think it was GPS or development locations.
So on top of this map.
What?
Yeah, let me see if we can get a copy of that. It's not in this presentation.
Yeah, I know it, but that's what. I'll quit. So we can see that map. I have a question for you about the map, if we can get it.
Okay.
So the blue is the high use corridor,
It is.
and the red is,
Those are two different wintering populations,
Oh.
the north population and the south, and they have some overlap, but yeah. So this was just an illustration of having two populations where we can identify the high use areas and stopovers. Again, just a same data, just a different population.
Mr. President,
yes, Mr. Schmidt.
We have the,
That's okay if you don't have it.
fourth quarter leases, but we don't have the existing development on top of the bags.
Can we get it emailed in?
Mr. Schmidt?
Dr. Sawyer, do we know on that, back to Red Desert Migration Corridor, do we know what the widest point of that corridor is? Does anybody have that information?
I don't
Been
have
able
it
to
off
find
the top of
anything
my.
on
I don't have it off the top of my head, but you know, when we did the assessment, we just focused on the high use part of that corridor, and so it was much narrower than the corridor that
Right.
under the department's definition. So I don't have those numbers off the top of my head. All right. Anything?
Mr. President, Commissioners, Director Talbot, one thing I'd just like to emphasize Paul's great presentation was, so in 2016, when the commission adopted the migration strategy, at that point in time, the decision was made to incorporate all of the corridor, the high, medium, and low use, and that we weren't going to partition it out at that time. But when we, in our strategy, when we get down to the APD level evaluation on the case-by-case basis in the field, those are the exact components that will be analyzed and discussed at that point. So the filter that we're using right now, the 90% rule, is applied to the entire corridor to see what portion, if at all, a nominated oil and gas lease intersects or overlaps the entire corridor. When we get down to the site-specific level at the APD stage, then, just as Dr. Sawyer had pointed out, the analysis will include, is there a stopover? Is it the high-use portion of the corridor? Is it a low-use portion? Those are the kind of factors that then, at that site-specific level, will be analyzed and discussed at the time that they request an application for permit to drill. So, just wanted to clarify that.
Those won't be, I mean, so you have APD, application for a permit to drill. And you have the upfront decision whether to ask for withdrawal of an oil and gas lease. Right?
Correct, on the entire corridor, yes.
Are you telling me that we only look at the high use stopover stuff at the time of the APD, or are we looking at the decision whether to ask for withdrawal or object to a leasing decision, initial leasing decision, are we looking at stopovers, winter range, frequency of use, high use, moderate use?
Yes, I didn't mean to allude that those aren't important. So those are components of the filter, but the filter is looking at the entire corridor, not just the high use portion at that time. It's looking at the corridor in its entirety. But Commissioner Crank, you are correct. If that parcel also overlaps a stopover area or bottleneck, that's also taken into account at that first filter stage.
Okay, so we're looking at the important factors that Dr. Sawyer talked about at the initial stage and also at the
site-specific
stage.
Correct.
Okay.
Mr. President,
Mr. Schmidt.
Scott, one question for you. On those instances where they file for the APD and we go in, the department goes in and makes a recommendation on possibly where to put that well site, how does that factor into their decision? I mean, is that they just take our opinion, the department's opinion, and do what they want to anyway, or?
As we discussed last time, and I'm sure some of our stakeholders here today will reiterate that, with the special lease notice, it is our recommendation that those habitats be avoided. And at this point, we haven't reached any APDs. We're still early in the process, so.
But it's just a recommendation of
It
ours.
is still a recommendation.
Right. They can still do whatever they need to do within those guidelines.
Yeah, and as explained last time in Du Bois, the recourse is if that agreement can't be reached at the on-site, so to speak, at the site-specific evaluation, then there's a variety of recourses that the BLM has to their disposal, and probably the one that we would recommend would be the reinitiation of NEPA to reevaluate exactly how that nominated parcel through the NEPA process should be developed.
Mr. Smith, then do we use that data that he had the distance between, the first part of the slides, at the end of that study, how far away were they? 2 kilometers or something, or 1 point something? 1 kilometer? 1 kilometer at the beginning and 2 at the end, or what was the numbers?
They were a kilometer further away.
At the end?
So, Mr. President, as Dr. Sawyer had indicated in some of his closing remarks, we've asked what would be the ability to go back and look at that Pinedale anticline data set in reference to the migration corridors that have now been designated coming down into the north end of the Pinedale anticline. That's some of the information that is lacking in these deep gas fields. And as we move forward, we're hopeful that looking at this 17-year data set retrospectively will give us some kind of indication as to what is the density of infrastructure where Hall's data shows some negative response. And that's kind of some of the lacking information we have specific to corridors. Dr. Sawyer's work has been outstanding in relation to winter ranges. We need a little finer scale as it relates now to these migration corridors.
Dr. Sawyer, is there additional research we need to do? I know you said that on many of these corridors, we'd be wasting, I'm gonna paraphrase, but we're data rich on collared deer. So what additional research, if you had $1 billion to spend and you were gonna go out and figure out how much surface disturbance can occur in a migration corridor without harming the population? What additional research may be out there other than re-examining the data that we already have, which I think is a great idea, but what additional research may be necessary?
Yeah, again, we've kind of focused in on mule deer, and we've kind of focused in on oil and gas, and there's a lot of renewable energy coming down the line with wind, and like I mentioned, solar, and there's other species that are going to be affected in addition to mule deer, pronghorn, and elk, and so I don't know. I guess short answer would be I just think we need maybe the more forward we can look and anticipate what sort of developments are coming down the line and try to get ahead of those, especially with wind. I think that could help us make these decisions easier in the long run. With mule deer and oil and gas, I think our best opportunity now is to retrospectively look at those Pinedale data, but keep our radar up for opportunities, whether the west side of the MPL project, if there's mule deer along the Green River that are going to be migrating through oil and gas, maybe we get that on our radar. If Continental Divide Wamsutter expands into the haystacks, maybe we keep that on our radar. So I think just be vigilant and jump on the opportunities when they present themselves.
Mr. President?
Yes, sir.
It's a totally different subject, I guess, maybe, but where are we at on our wind study south of Rollins?
So we have a whole lot of baseline data. There are still no turbines, but they started road construction last summer. So this summer was the second year of road construction. And just to give you a sense, from Sinclair at the interstate, it used to take about an hour and a half to drive from there to the Sierra Madre part of the project area. And now you can do it in about 15 minutes. So there's some good roads out there. It's still not clear when the turbines are going to go up, but I think the last time I heard, they're probably thinking 2020 before we get actually turbines out there. But with the department's help, we are recatching those deer in March, and we're going to equip them with collars that last another 2 years. And so with this first round of collars, we're going to be able to see how or if they've responded to the road construction. And when we get that next round of collars back, we'll be in the early stages of turbine development. And that turbine development, it's not clear how long a development phase that's going to be, whether it's going to be 4 or 5 years. But I think we're going to be into that project another 6, 8, maybe 10 years.
At one time we talked about, since you're already out there, let's collar some elk and some antelope and see what effect this has on them. At first I heard that we weren't successful in that request. So we haven't collared any elk and antelope to see how this is affecting them?
No. I might probably defer to Scott on this mostly, but my understanding of that situation was the only MOU that the BLM had with the power company in Wyoming, that's checkerboard land, was to look at mule deer. And there wasn't a lot of interest in expanding to elk or pronghorn.
On behalf of the landowner or on behalf of the federal agency?
Scott?
It was on behalf of the private landowner. They were interested in the mule deer work, but not expanding into other species. So.
I wonder why. You don't have to answer that.
Okay, I won't.
All right, blue sheet time. Rob Shaw, would you like to address this topic, item 11?
We're not on, are we on 11? We're not on 11 yet. We just finished 10.
No, we just finished 11.
10.
Oh, we just did 10? Holy mackerel. Sorry. Doug Bremeyer, I'm sorry.
Mr. President, members of the commission, and Director Talbot, thanks. What what I'd like to do is just give you an overview of the seasonal range mapping process that we use within the department. And so basically we're using a methodology that builds off of a protocol that was developed in the 1980s. And just to give you a little overview, this is a map that was generated in the 1970s by Garvis Roby. That was the biologist out of Jackson. He flew the migration corridors here north of the National Elk Refuge 2 days a week, weather permitting. And he also ran the road here to Togedy and walked tracks out every time elk crossed, and monitored numbers of elk that crossed the highway. And that data set went back to 1945. And back in the 30s, they were also interested in the migrations through from Yellowstone to the National Elk Refuge. But this was kind of the original spaghetti map that Commissioner Crank referred to, and the biologists just drew lines on the maps where they documented animals moving. And it was largely debated whenever there was development proposed, because the pen width or the width of what a biologist would draw on there with a Sharpie or with a colored pencil, when you transpose that to a different scale map, it often took up quite a bit of ground. And so there was a lot of debate on whether or not that was an appropriate use of, or appropriately identified on the landscape. So moving to GPS collars, that gave us a lot better configuration of what was moving through here. And then as Hull talked about, using the Brownian bridge model, that really helped to weigh the importance of some of those, the distribution. So in the 1980s, we worked with the federal land managers to develop standard definitions. And we conducted annual reviews that was primarily, again, based on the frequency those animals were using a geographic area, whether or not it was a corridor or seasonal range, such as parturition or crucial winter range. In 2016, then, of course, the ungulate migration corridor strategy was adopted by the commission, and that added the seasonal range mapping process to using the migration corridors to identify those important habitats. And as you remember, you identified 4 actions within that ungulate migration corridor strategy. First action is that migration bottlenecks and ungulate stopover areas were added to that vital habitat designation, which already was joining the crucial winter range designations. And also the commission has the department recommend that no significant declines occur on species distribution or abundance, or that there's a loss of habitat function in those habitats. The second action of that corridor strategy was to designate the corridor, which using the seasonal range definitions that we've worked on since the 1980s. And the basic steps for that are the bullet points below that, where we plot the repeated observations, we consult with federal land managers, our BLM and Forest Service partners and other land managers. We discuss it at a regional level, and then see if it's even feasible or worth doing. And then regional personnel then start to reach out to interested parties. They share the data that's going to be used to designate the corridor. At that point, it's sent up to us at the Cheyenne level, and then we conduct a review of it, make sure that some of the public outreach has occurred, and then we'll designate that as a corridor. And then it's posted online on the department's website. Action 3 is, if you remember, that is the risk assessment, and I'll go ahead and give you a copy. I just brought this one along. It might give you a perspective on the work that went into the sublet corridor and identifying existing threats, potential threats, and opportunities for conservation measures that can be taken place. And this step really took a lot of time. Regional managers work closely with stakeholders and energy industry, landowners, hunters and anglers to identify those opportunities. We also work with the Migration Initiative, and then we again work cooperatively with those stakeholders to identify those proactive strategies. So then the fourth action is where I'll transition here with a few more slides and then turn it over to Angie, and then she'll talk a little bit about action 4, which is the input we have on federal surface projects and their planning efforts. And that's really where kind of the rubber meets the road for us, and we're looking at those site-specific information and the case-by-case basis. Last thing I want to do is just show you the 3 corridors that we have currently identified. And so this is the sublet herd unit with the stopover areas. And again, as Hall discussed with you, there's some disjunct areas because this is 2 or more animals using the Brownian Bridge. So some of these are going to be a little bit off to the side. They may not be connected on here, and that's just because one animal or one radio collared animal moved through that area. But this is basically the designation that we made. It was based on 131 mule deer and 319 migration sequences. And as we speak right now, the agency is working with the university for collaring some additional deer that are more resident deer along the interstate here, and they finished up some of that collaring earlier this fall once the hunting season closed to kind of get some of these shorter distance migrations that occur in some of this country down here. There's other animals that do move in this area that we don't have designated yet, but once it's kind of a dynamic process. If we get more animals collared or more information, we'll reevaluate this. There's one deer that makes a movement all the way into Idaho, which is 255 miles. And this corridor encompasses, the herd unit encompasses, I think, 800,000 acres. The corridor does. So what kind of outreach we had with this designation was we had emails to stakeholders. Again, we discussed with our federal partners. We had public meetings in Cheyenne and at the regional level. Numerous emails, mass emails to folks and stakeholders regarding this corridor. The Platte Valley was our second corridor that we designated, and that was based on 42 mule deer, and it was 120 migration sequences. And we had news releases that were sent to media outlets, over 4,000 email addresses. We proposed, we had the proposal posted online for comments. Again, we contacted federal partners, conservation districts, and again, individual landowners, and they had public meetings in Saratoga and Laramie as well. The most recent one that we just finished designating is the Baggs Mule Deer Migration Corridor. Some people call this the Atlantic Rim, and Atlantic Rim is only a portion of the Baggs Mule Deer herd, and so we thought it was more appropriate to call it the Baggs Mule Deer Migration Corridor. It's based on 118 mule deer and 298 migration sequences, and the migration sequence is basically a fall and a spring, a fall movement or a spring movement. And then that cumulatively has been added into the Brownian Bridge model. Outreach for the Baggs mule deer was to emails to NGOs and industry, contacting our federal partners and working with them on the need for this data set, and then individual landowner contacts. And they're currently going to be working on a risk assessment for this herd unit this winter. And so they'll have a document that is similar to the one that you guys have that you can pass through up there. And with that, I think I'd like to turn it over to Angie, and then she can give an overview of her information.
Good afternoon, Commissioners, Mr. President, Director Talbot. We'll give them just a minute here to get mine up, but like you said, I'm going to give you a brief update since we met in December and I spoke, and just reviewing the department's recommendations for the fourth quarter oil and gas parcel lease sale, as well as the department's recommendations for the Office of State Lands and Investment November sale. So the recommendations for that fourth quarter sublet mule deer migration corridor, just to give an overview here, there were 581 leases in this lease sale, with 26 of those being in the corridor. And so
these are leases that we've already commented on and have already been acted on.
Yes, yep.
Okay.
And out of that, what our recommendation was to defer those 4 leases entirely, and then to do a partial lease sale And just to explain quickly what a partial lease sale is, this diagram up here, you can see these two little pieces right here in the middle of the corridor. So some of the leases come in multiple parts. There might be 3 or 4 sections to a lease. And so we looked at those ones that if part of those sections were entirely in the corridor, then they would delete or defer temporarily those parcels. It is important to know, though, for the BLM to comply with a recent decision from the District of Idaho court order, they had to extend the comment period on these leases, or at least 578 of them. So instead of going on sale in December, you will not see them for sale until February. They will continue to have a December sale, but only 3 parcels that did not have any greater sage-grouse habitat affiliated with them. And so there's a map showing the preliminary lease parcel sales for the sublet migration corridor, and then the final lease parcel sales. Looking particularly at the Bags Mule Deer Migration Corridor for 4th quarter leases, there were 30 leases in the migration corridor. The department recommended 11 of those be deferred. There's a preliminary picture of those lease parcels, and unfortunately we don't have a final yet from the BLM.
When's that sale?
This one will be on the 4th quarter, so this will be extended to that February sale instead of the December one because of the Idaho District Court ruling.
When was it supposed to be, like in December? Is that what you say, 4th quarter? Or?
Exactly, yeah.
So can you comment till when?
The
February?
comments are closed now.
Oh.
They ended last week. What they did is, because of their instructional memo, they are instructed to do their wholesales in a 6-month period of time. In their old process, they did it in an 18-month period of time. So in order to accommodate that, their environmental assessment went from a 30-day comment period down to 15 days, I believe. And because of that Idaho court ruling, they now have to go back to a 30-day comment period. So these 4th quarter lease sales went back open for another, I think, 16 days of comment, which is now closed, and then they'll go for sale in February. Okay, so Office of State Lands and Investment. As you remember, they deleted parcels until a STIP could be created, and the following STIP was placed on all parcels in the sublet migration corridor for the November sale. It's important to note that there weren't any parcels in the Bags or the Platte Valley migration corridor that were nominated for this sale. And the stipulation that was created, 146, I'll read that to you. This lease is issued subject to and conditioned upon leasee acknowledgement and agreement that the parcel of land encompassed by this lease is located wholly or partially within an ungulate migration corridor as designated by the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. Exploration and development activities shall be undertaken and managed as a controlled surface use. Prior to exploration and development, leasee is required to submit Wyoming Game and Fish a plan to conserve and or mitigate impacts to the migration corridor, including strategies to avoid bottlenecks and stopover areas. Plans must be approved by the director in consultation with Wyoming Game and Fish Department before exploration and development activities can occur. The maximum surface restriction imposed by this stipulation will be a restriction of 1 oil and gas pad per 640 acres. All attempts should be made to avoid and minimize impacts to the surface in order to maintain habitat functionality within the ungulate migration corridor. And so the result of that sale, total there are 256 leases available statewide. 24 of those were in the sublet migration corridor. So then to wrap up, I wanted to touch base again on other opportunities for us to comment and weigh in. And we have been encouraging and recommending to the Bureau of Land Management to either amend each individual resource management plan out of their field offices that contain a designated migration corridor, or to do a statewide amendment. I know that they're currently having conversations on what would be the best avenue for them to go. And again, if they amended those plans or did a statewide amendment, that would allow for a specific stipulation to be developed over the special use language notice. We are also working with the Bureau of Land Management and department staff to really clarify what our expectations are for implementing this special lease notice. And what I mean by that is we are planning a joint training between the BLM field staff and also our staff to go through that process with them. And then we just want to continue to iterate that our goal and focus of this, and our entire strategy and recommendations, is to maintain that functionality of these designated migration corridors. That's it.
That's it?
That's it. Much shorter than last time.
Yeah, that's very good. Any questions of Angie? Right. I will start then with the.
Can we take a break?
No. Yeah, we'll take a break. Can we come back at 10 after 4, please? Thank you.
I don't think we're gonna get done at 4:20.
I don't
Yes, sir.
I had a note for the schedule too at the end. I had my question answered, so it's one of these weird things.
Okay, yeah, the last one I saw here.
Yeah. I
Number
had
13, you're okay, huh?
Yeah.
All right, thanks. Thank you. Where were we? Ready for the blue
I
sheet?
guess I would ask if there's any questions from the commission to start with. Discussion from the commission.
Is there any questions from the commission on Angie's presentation or Mr. Smith? Right at this moment, we'll probably have some. I will start with the blue sheets, and Rob Shaw, would you like to address this agenda item 11?
Thank you, sir. Commission, again, Rob Shaw with Mountain Pursuit. I guess our opinion of the recommendation from the department right now is not nearly conservative enough. And I'm struggling to see how the strategy that they've recommended aligns with the 2016 ungulate strategy that was adopted by the commission. For example, the 2016 mitigation corridor strategy identify vital ungulate migration bottlenecks and vital ungulate stopover areas. And nowhere in the strategy did I see where those identified where the leases were proposed. So that's a mystery. I'm not seeing how that was applied. The 90% coverage area for deferment. I don't understand where that figure came from and how 90% was decided upon. It's not in the ungulate strategy from 2016. And you can look at this from a couple ways. Is with industry's technology and ability to horizontal drill, that might not be an issue for some of these leases. And then is 90% conservative enough or too conservative? Why wasn't 50% used as the figure to recommend deferment? So that's a question I just have not heard or seen, needs to be answered. And finally, again, the strategy or the recommendation doesn't necessarily acknowledge the industry's ability to horizontal drill and therefore minimize surface impacts, but still tap into those leases. And I'm not too sure exactly where the technology is there. I lived through Pinedale, and I saw horizontal drilling improve in the years I was there and working there. But again, I'm not too sure how deep these wells are proposed to be or how far that horizontal drilling can move to minimize surface impacts. So what we'd recommend is that the commission go back to the department and ask them to see how these questions that we have are applied to their strategy moving forward. And if not, we wonder how come a buffer can't just be drawn outside the corridor and just have no surface impact in that buffer and also the corridor. Not deferment, but no surface impact. We'd recommend a half-mile buffer. So you have the corridor, try the buffer outside the corridor, no surface impact within the buffer or the corridor. And finally, the case-by-case basis in terms of workload, if for every APD there's a case-by-case basis where the game and fish has to comment on that, we're concerned about the workload that's going to be for game and fish personnel. I haven't seen these leases. The project hasn't been developed yet, but let's say it's 7,700 wells like down the Jonah expansion. It's a lot of work. So we're concerned about how much workload is going to be on the game and fish for a case-by-case basis to evaluate each APD. Any questions?
Okay, is Mr. Smith, are you here? Yeah. I'm sorry, Scotty. Could you refresh my memory how we came to the 90% on the corridors, please?
Mr. President, yes, so through the whole filtering process, threshold, however you want to look at it, we are looking for enough space outside the corridor to locate the infrastructure. So we used a section as the example. So you have 640 acres of a nominated lease parcel. At 90%, that would be 64 acres outside of the corridor. Thus, we felt that even with these large multi-well pads that Paul showed where you're drilling up to 50 wells, they've never exceeded that much acreage. So we landed on a 90% filter to use going forward when we evaluate these species.
We developed this strategy, was it 15 or 16, was it? Or,
The strategy was approved in January of 26.
but you all worked on it, who,
And
to
then-
refresh everybody's memory, who was on the work on all this back in the day? You had NGOs, you had the BLM, you had the Petroleum Association.
Yeah, we have a whole variety of stakeholders. Yeah, all the environmental interests.
Petroleum Association, stock growers.
County commissioners. There was a wide variety that helped us put together that 4-action framework. Where it was put into play, action 4, the first federal project then was back earlier this year with the third quarter oil and gas lease sales. So the actual implementation of action 4 happened in 28.
So just to put you on the spot then, how do you feel about that 90%?
90% was just something we thought was a fairly balanced approach to looking for how much space is needed to maintain the functionality of that corridor by siting infrastructure outside. You asked a couple months ago in Du Bois, it's a starting point. It's not a hard, we're using that as our filter, but there's nothing, it's not engraved in stone. So if it's proven that that is too conservative and we need something different, we can obviously
And how would we change that? Or
address it.
how do we address that? Or
Again, it was based on how much space outside the corridor is reasonable to expect infrastructure to be developed where they can still extract resources underneath the corridor but not impede the functionality of that habitat.
so what are you saying? You give them that 10% to put the wells in that to drill? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly.
I could be mistaken, Scott, please let me know if I am. If I understand the strategy that you're recommending for these leases, if the lease covers 90% of the corridor you have identified, you recommend that lease be deferred or not sold, correct?
Not sold. Yeah, it's deferred until such time as Angie explained. The BLM can come up with a specific stipulation that would address migration corridors in their resource management.
And that's only so. So just graphically, so this is the corridor, right? So you have 90% of the lease is in the corridor. That's deferred for time. But if you have a lease that's 50% in the corridor, they can drill right here, right?
Correct. And that in the second instance that you just drew, that's where we recommended the special lease notice.
And that would be on a case-by-case basis for you to come in and take a look at it. So in other words, this would be deferred until a certain time and that could be exploded, right? Exploited, but they could drill inside the lease, inside the corridor too, correct here, because it's not deferred.
And our recommendation is at the drilling point, at the APD stage,
correct.
that they develop outside.
Outside. I guess if I understand correctly, the 90% figure for the 90% level for deferment was not dictated by the policy that was adopted in 2016. And so that's been developed since that time, correct?
Correct. So the policy in 2016 said with federal projects, BLM oil and gas leasing,
Right.
case-by-case analysis would be used. Unlike a crucial winter range stipulation where anytime a crucial winter range, a project occurs within a crucial winter range, there's a blanket stipulation applied, that timing stipulation is applied to any of those activities inside the crucial winter range. The difference here is we evaluate every parcel on a case-by-case basis. That's where this filter evaluation, the 90%, came about.
Well, we would, thank you, sir. And I guess one more question, Scott. Were the vital, or the migration corridor bottlenecks and a couple of areas identified in the strategy? I just didn't see them in what was presented.
Strategy?
Yeah, just, so for example, right now, if I understand correctly, there's what, 500 plus leases that are up. 4 have been recommended for deferment because they've had 90% or more in the migration corridor. But if you had a stopover area that was in the migration corridor, how would that be conducted?
So as I explained to Commissioner Crank, that's part of our evaluation, bottleneck stopover areas, corridor, the proportion of the corridor. We have a whole matrix that we look at before recommending either the deferral or special stopover areas are part of that analysis.
Right. I understand that, but you have them, there could be stopover areas that aren't in the 90% for leases, and you're not recommending deferral for the leases that would cover that area. For example, if this is the stopover area here, and a lease is here, it's not covering 90%, or the lease doesn't cover 90%. This will be protected by APD, case by case.
On a case-by-case, exactly.
Sir, I think your statement's wrong.
Right.
If we look at a lease and it's a critical stopover area or bottleneck, we're gonna request deferral of the lease in total, irregardless of the 90% rule.
That's not what the strategy says right now. There's only 4 leases that are.
Strategy was what we adopted in 2016. What we're talking about is our case-by-case analysis now on existing lease sales.
But if a lease is sold, it can be drilled.
Not necessarily. I mean, you missed a whole bunch. You should have been in Du Bois. You missed a whole bunch of stuff that was discussed there. And you know, if there's a stopover area that's critical to a migration corridor, we're going to protect the wildlife. And so we're going to request deferral of the lease, whether it's 90% in the corridor, whatever. Okay, so your statement's wrong.
If the lease is sold, it's not deferred before the lease is sold, it can be developed.
And the leases that affect the leases that affect the migration corridor, we're requesting not a stipulation, but there's a notice on there saying, if you're going to drill this lease, you're gonna have to go through the APD process and likely have to do an environmental impact statement. If you can't reach agreement on where you're gonna drill, you know, our whole idea is let's keep all surface disturbance outside of the migration corridor. And the 90% rule maybe does that. I don't know if 90%'s right, but it allows them enough room to have their pad outside of the corridor and drill 50 wells from there directionally under the corridor. But, I mean, if it's a critical stopover area, if it's a bottleneck, we're gonna object. We're gonna ask that it be totally deferred.
Right.
Can I address?
Please do.
Okay, Mr. President, just to shed a little light on too, and I know we're really focused on the 90%, and keep in mind that was one filter. In our analysis, we are looking at bottlenecks to date. Therefore, all the bottlenecks are in the sublet migration corridor, and there's no bottlenecks identified in Platte Valley or Bags, and there has been no lease parcel sales up in the bottlenecks. So you're right, we would address that definitely if they were nominated. So far to date, they haven't been nominated. the stopovers as well. So we're looking at that 90%, like Scott said, it's really about adequate space outside the corridor for infrastructure. There could be parcels, and there has been, that are only 40 acres in size. And that would put maybe 10 acres or, 4 acres outside the corridor. Obviously, we would look at deferring that one. So we have to use what I call just good judgment in analyzing each parcel. The 90%, we kind of got stuck on there because it's an easy way to explain it, but there are a whole bunch of other filters that we take in place to ensure that that infrastructure can be placed outside the corridor. Thanks.
Thank you.
Before Angie leaves, Mr. President,
Yes,
can
sir.
I ask a question? So this goes back to our decision-making matrix. Hal, in his presentation, talked about applying, I think it was the Browning Bridge model to these, and where they broke these migration routes into high, moderate, and low, or the analogy he used was the interstate, state highway, and county roads. Could we better incorporate that into our decision-making process so that the high and moderate use could be more protected, maybe less so on the county roads?
I think it is, but currently it's involved in more of that site-specific analysis part of it. And what I mean by that is, yeah, there is high-use areas, those traffic interstate areas that he referred to, and that is where we would leave it up to that local staff to identify those. They can look at the raw data. They know that information. They also know a lot of the on-the-grounds features that would impact the location of a well pad that was going in. So we have looked at those areas, but that'll be part of the direction we give our field staff to look at bottleneck stopovers, high-use areas, all the different considerations that we want to draw attention to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if this is a high use area, we should be requesting deferral of that lease. I mean, I understand relying on your local expertise, but I would hope at the Scott Smith's level, that lease gets deferred. Are we doing that? That's the $1 million question.
I would say we are not, Mr. President, Commissioner Crank, unless we feel that there's not adequate space outside the corridor, outside of that high-use area, that the infrastructure can be placed.
Okay, now you really, if this is a high-use area in the migration corridor, we want no surface disturbance, correct?
Correct.
And we would request deferral of that lease, correct?
So, Mr. President,
Forget about the 90% rule for a second.
right. So the corridor that the commission adopted the corridor as an all-inclusive habitat. So the corridors that we're evaluating contain high, moderate, and low. And it was the commission's decision not to go with just one proportional use area, but the whole corridor. So when we evaluate the entire corridor for the first go, it has all three.
I'm talking about leasing decisions, Scott. So we have a lease that is in a high-use area of a corridor. I don't care what we did in 2016. We're looking at a lease today. What the commission directed you to do was on a case-by-case basis, look at these leases and on the best science available, make a recommendation to BLA. If it is in a high-use area, and forget about the 90% rule for a second.
Correct.
That is a lease that should be requested to be deferred. Maybe if there is a sufficient room outside of the corridor to place a drill pad and directionally drill underneath the corridor and not affect the functionality of the corridor, we might not request deferral, but we would request special considerations at the time the permit is issued to drill.
And I'd say we're doing all of that except at the initial filter stage. Instead of just looking at one portion of the corridor, we're looking at the corridor in entirety. Again, with the caveat, we need space outside of that. So we're not going to cite infrastructure in a low use, in a high use, or a moderate use. We're treating the corridor at the first blush as the vital habitat.
should we
Right.
change that?
I think we're talking about the same thing, only I think, if I understand what you're saying, you're asking the department to add another consideration into this.
I'm trying to avoid the 307s again.
You know,
If this is a high-use area of the corridor, there shall be no surface disturbance, because I believe that would create a problem for that herd unit.
and that's exactly what the outcome is when we evaluate the corridor as an entirety. We're still recommending the infrastructure outside the corridor.
I understand it. You're trying to tell me you're being overprotective, but I don't want
Exactly.
the public to walk away from this meeting saying we don't look at the usage of the corridor when we're evaluating leases on a case-by-case basis on the best science available.
And I guess, Mr.
We
Craig,
just heard from the expert that the best science available can tell us what is a high-use area, what's a moderate-use area, and what's a low-use area. So I don't care if we're at the filter stage, we're at the APD stage. I think the department needs to use the best science available, and part of that is what is the usage of this area the animals are making? Is it high use, is it moderate use, or is it little use?
Commissioner Crankin, what we're saying, the tack we took was all of the corridors equally important at our first filter, whether it's high, medium, or low. And what Angie was just explaining to Commissioner Culver was at the APD stage, then that's where we get down to the specifics of the proportional use of the corridor, the topography.
Why would it be different at the APD stage? If it's a high use when the lease is issued and sold, it's still going to be a high use, I assume, at the APD stage. It's the same evaluation.
It is. We're just being much more inclusive by encompassing the entirety of the corridor, rather than just looking specifically at the smaller proportion that's of high use. It's still very important. We're just saying the entire corridor is important.
I got you.
Mr. President, can I say something? And maybe I'm looking at this way too simply. Rennie just sent us some information here a week or so ago, and I read through some of those surveys that were done. 64% of the Wyoming population wants us to protect corridors. 73% of the population is worried about loss of wildlife habitat. We've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars with Hall Sawyer and his group. He just gave us a demonstration on how important or the effects of any kind of development on mule deer populations. We're down 20,000 mule deer right now, 30,000. He basically said we'll probably never see that number, 50,000 again. Why are we even considering any activity within these corridors? Why can't we just simply say no activity within the corridor, period? And forget about 90%, 10%, and everything else we've been knocking around here for the last two commission meetings. Maybe I'm missing something.
Mr. President, Commissioner Schmidt, I think we are saying that exactly. We just chose the special lease notice because that was what was immediately available to us. We're still, our recommendations still center around protecting the corridor, siting infrastructure outside the corridor. So at the end of the day, whether it's a stipulation, whether we wait on a stipulation crafted by the BLM or applying a special lease notice, we're still, the recommendation is the same. No infrastructure inside the corridor will be the department's recommendation going forward.
Period.
Period.
Well, Mr. President.
I'm frustrated because this seems to be getting so complicated
Exactly.
when it's pretty simple in my simple mind. Depending, surface use activity in a designated, scientifically studied migration corridor will have an effect on that herd. So we're trying to cite all development outside of the corridor. And we're going to look at it on a case-by-case basis. We're going to look at everything. We're going to look at the science that supports that's really part of a corridor. We're going to look at this high use, is it moderate use, is it little use? We're going to look at the topography. We're going to look at, every bit of scientifically available data we can, and then we're gonna make our best recommendation to BLM. I mean, why does that have to be so complicated? And if we're gonna err, we are going to, I believe as a commissioner, we need to err on the benefit of wildlife.
Right.
That's our job.
I mean, that's our tagline, conserve wildlife, serve people.
It's
Yeah,
just
but I
that
don't-
simple.
isn't it split estates on out there? I mean, the Game and Fish can't just say, no, you can't drill. I mean, once those, you can ask for it, but, I mean, isn't there split estate stuff to deal with where you don't have control over it?
Mr. President, Commissioner Byrd, at this point, that we haven't been faced with the split estate. It's all been federal leases. And Commissioner Crank, Commissioner Smid, we're absolutely in lockstep with your direction. And to answer your question, I don't know. I guess it's just a difference of opinion at the end of the day how we get there. Whether we recommend deferral of everything or we use the special lease notice and deferrals on very specific instances. At the end of the day, our recommendation doesn't change. To maintain that functioning habitat, we're recommending infrastructure outside the corridor.
But let's tell the public precisely what we're doing. I mean, to say at the filter stage, we don't consider whether it's high use, moderate use, or little use is silly. Of course we should consider that. And I understand, Scott, you're saying we're gonna protect this corridor, whether it's high, moderate, or little. But it's a factor we're going to consider, because I think the more transparent we make our filter process, the less we have doubt from the NGOs and the environmental groups, and the oil and gas companies know what they're dealing with. But at the end of the day, we're gonna look at every lease, we're gonna apply every bit of scientific data we can that's reliable, and we're gonna make a decision, and when we err, we will err in the favor of wildlife. Why is that? I mean, that's what I think the policy says.
And Mr. President, Commissioner Crank, I believe that's exactly what we're doing.
Okay.
Yeah, we did all this in Du Bois, didn't we?
Yeah.
All right, do it
10
again.
hours or something.
All right.
Just to finish.
Yeah, please do, because we got about confusing.
Yeah.
10 others behind you. Thank you.
It's very confusing, and the 90% is kind of came out of history. What we recommend for the migration corridor, there's a 1 mile buffer on either side of the corridor, no surface disturbance in the migration corridor, and 1 mile buffer outside it. Pretty simple and direct. That's what
You bumped it by half a mile.
I did.
Yeah.
All right, thanks.
That's because what you said about
1 kilometer.
one well within the section. Thank you.
Thank you. Bruce Lawson.
Good afternoon. My name is Bruce Lawson. I am a resident native of Casper, Wyoming. First of all, I'd like to thank the members of the commission for the time they commit to serve on the commission. It's got to be a great demand on your time, and I appreciate what you do. I'd like to also state that, you know, I've lived in Casper all my life, and the reason I live in Casper and Wyoming is for the great hunting and fishing outdoor opportunities in Wyoming. My brother, some of you may have known him, was Jay Lawson. He was the former chief of the Wildlife Division. He had a great love for mule deer, and so do I. Commissioner Schmidt couldn't have said it any better than his comments a few minutes ago on how we all feel about mule deer. I guess what I would like to see the department and the commission move forward to a formal request to the Department of Interior and Bureau of Land Management to, at this point in time, defer any future leasing in the corridor areas until we can study the issue more directly. In the handout that I have here from various wildlife organizations, I agree with their recommendation the state could request statewide RMP amendment process to address all migration corridor priorities prior to any more leasing. So I would stress that I do believe that the department and the commission could go a long ways with the Department of Interior to simply request a deferral on any future leasing of in the corridor areas. The other thing I might add too is I served for 3 years on the Wyoming Game and Fish Department's original sage grouse working group that was formed to address the issues of threats to the sage grouse long before Governor Friedenthal imposed the executive order formed the SIGIT. So, and I also have served for years on the local Bates Hole, Shirley Basin sage grouse working group. I'm a mine development and reclamation manager for a bentonite mining company, and we operate in about 6 counties, have around 80,000 acres under permit with the Department of Environmental Quality, and I have a major bentonite mining operation in Johnson County, and over 25,000 acres of that operation are in the Natrona core area. So I know firsthand what you have to do to conduct development activities. Granted, this is mining, not oil and gas, but it's all the same. It's surface disturbance. So I have a true understanding of what it takes to conduct development in core sage grouse areas, and it can be done. You look at what the SIGIT's done, what we've done in conservation of sage grouse, and I think the same can be said for what we can do in conserving mule deer in the state of Wyoming with the same type of a principle set forward with sage grouse core areas. We could do the same thing with mule deer corridor areas. So thanks for your time today. And again, I look at the again, I'm 62 years old. I've lived in Wyoming all my life, and unfortunately, I don't see really a greater threat to Wyoming right now in terms of our wildlife and our open spaces as maybe any time in my lifetime. The other thing I'll add too is my father was a petroleum geologist. He used to have a bumper sticker on the car that said Wyoming oil and gas is my bread and butter. So I understand too the importance of oil production in Wyoming in terms of the economy and jobs. You know, I lived a pretty good life because of oil and gas, put me through college. But again, the threats to our wildlife resources right now in Wyoming, I think, are the greatest maybe I've seen in my lifetime, and particularly the threats to mule deer with chronic wasting disease and oil and gas development. The other thing I might add too, if you looked on the news recently, do we really need to lease these areas for oil and gas development at this point in time? Currently, the U.S. produces 11 million barrels of oil a day. We're the second highest producer of crude oil in the world, just behind Russia, which is at 11.2 million barrels. So really, do we really need to lease these areas in this important mule deer corridor area? Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lawson. Okay, if you'd all be cognizant of our time. Derek Farmer.
My name is Derek Farmer. I'm the Executive Director of Wyoming Hunters and Anglers Alliance. Thank you all for the opportunity to be here, and thank you for everything you do. You know, a lot of these comments today are going to be directed at the corridors that are designated, so I'm going to forgo the comments that I have on those. But then I'm particularly interested in the corridors that we do not have this designation for yet. How many more mule deer herds are at risk right now that don't have the same protection that are being offered by the other areas that have had this research done? The path of the pronghorn was identified in 1985, and 33 years later, it doesn't receive any protections at all. So I'm wondering if there's any way we can expedite the process of the protections that are being offered by you guys with the corridors. And I wonder how many corridors are currently under review for protection? And then how long is the average process for the 3 that we have? What does that look like? And if there's any way to expedite it, I think that goals are best to be specific, measurable, achievable, result-focused, and time-bound. So maybe if the commission could set some of those time parameters to have some of these designations made, we might be able to preserve more of our core habitats for the other ungulates that do not deserve to have their habitats developed. And with that, I'll stand for any questions.
Thank you. You bring up a good point about the antelope. They're kind of the little stepchild that nobody talks about, but that's a very good point.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bremeyer, do you have to go to the bathroom, or what do you need?
Mr. President, members of the commission, would you like me to address the antelope issue?
Please, thank you.
Couple minutes. So the antelope data, we've got pretty close to 300 animals that have been collared over that duration of time. It appears that when you run the Brownian bridge model on that sheer number of animals, it creates this conglomerate of a land use area that you could consider as a corridor that's approximately 40 to 50 miles wide. And so what we're doing now is working with Dr. Sawyer and the University of Wyoming to evaluate what specific subsets of those radio-collared animals should be considered. So the path of the pronghorn comes down to Trapper's Point, and then once they cross Trapper's Point, it's crucial winter range. And so the corridor does in fact extend through that designated winter range, but when you again run that on that large data set, it really gets muddied. And so we're looking at some of those antelope are actually truly migratory, some are nomadic, and some are resident. So that the best basis that we have right now is to try and tease out what stratums or what break those collars into subsets and then run the Brownian bridge on that subset. A lot of that data was not available to us until in the last few years. So it was proprietary for a number of reasons through different agencies and different groups that were doing the research. We had a little bit of a, I guess, a little bit of a tussle on where that data was at. We do have it, we're analyzing it, and I guess we'll continue to move forward, but we've got to refine how that Brownian bridge is applied to it.
Thank you. As long as you're on antelope, and somebody brought up that NPL project there, are we going to monitor how that affects things when they start, if they start drilling out there?
We would have to have you know, right now there's no radio-collared antelope that are in that area to my knowledge, and I think that we could use some of the data that we have to make recommendations once we run that Brownian bridge. And I guess I don't have a good answer unless we extend some collaring efforts on antelope there that are in that winter range.
I think that'd be something to look at before that thing gets drilled out. All right, as I said, be cognizant of our time. Nick Dobrik.
Thanks, President Asalmi, Director Talbot, Commissioners. My name is Nick Dobrik. I work for Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, and thank you for your past leadership on this issue and your attention today. Mr. Schmidt, Commissioner Schmidt, I guess you kind of hit the heart of the issue is the department is unable to ask for NSO, no surface occupancy, because they don't have that ability in the plan, in the BLM plan, and that's exactly why we're asking for lease deferral until that plan is developed. Now, one of the points I'm going to talk about is the need for a statewide amendment. That was addressed. I think that's something within the Commission's ability to ask the Department of Interior, to ask the BLM to do that, to ask for a statewide amendment, because we're talking about the sublet herd currently. This is going to play exactly the same story when we talk about the Bags corridor, when we talk about the North Platte. It's the same thing where those current BLM plans don't even recognize the migration corridors. They don't recognize the new science, so they can't provide for that proper stipulation in place. And that's the root of the issue. I got another handout that's in front of you guys. I guess I'll just quickly go through. I hope most of everybody's seen the handout we did for parcel 307, and we drew the attention to that one. It's not an isolated case. Parcel, here the first example, it's this handout that's in front of some of the commissioners. Commissioner Crank, it's right in front of your computer if you want to look at it. Parcel 307 was auctioned in the third quarter sale, and it did not get a competitive bid, so it went non-competitively for $1.50 an acre. You could see it crosses the entire corridor. And if we did a partial deferral here, we're only talking about 337 acres to be deferred, and the rest of the 1,000+ acres can move ahead. The second parcel, 679, is in the fourth quarter. That's on the table right now. That auction is going to be in February, as was mentioned previously. If this was deferred, it's only 12% to do a partial deferral. We're talking only 280 acres to defer this, and the other 2,000 acres could go move forward. On the back of this page, you can see what I'm talking about in terms of what we'd really like to see the department ask for in the commission in terms of a partial lease deferral. We're not talking about, you don't need to defer the whole parcel just because it touches the corridor. This is within the BLM's realm. This was discussed at the Cheyenne meeting that Governor Meade's staff organized in Cheyenne. And the BLM said, yeah, we could do this. We just need to be asked to do it as a partial lease deferral. On the next page, you can see it's not just environmental groups that are engaged in this issue. It's the broader sportsman community. You can see a letter from that we submitted to the fourth quarter sale to the BLM, and you can see the broad list of signers on the back of that page. About 10 Wyoming sportsmen's groups have spoken up. We sent a similar letter to the Office of State Lands and Investment with their upcoming sale for improvements on their stipulation. And other national groups have spoken up. Hundreds of hunters have spoken up on this issue. It's a broad agreement that these parcels should be deferred. Getting at another thing that was discussed is this map on this packet here. There is leasing currently going on in stopover areas. It seems like there's a misconception that we're not leasing stopover areas. The BLM, you can see the green parcels. I'm sorry, the green polygon is stopover. And you can see the BLM is leasing in stopover, as well as the upcoming November sale has leases in the stopover areas. And this is for the sublet herd. If you pulled up the bags corridor, you'd see, I did that yesterday, and you'd see even more leasing in the stopover areas. So it's not just in the sublet that it's happening. So I guess the ask is to slow down and let's get this right. We're not against development. We're against, we want to make sure it's done right, planned properly. And right now it seems like there's no certainty moving forward. So let's pivot on this issue and let's get it right sooner than later. And the final thing is a statewide amendment. I think right now, as I opened up, the Rollins, you're going to see the same thing. So if the commission department sends a formal letter to the Department of Interior, to the BLM, to ask for a statewide amendment or some sort of guidance, that will give you the tools available for a stipulation. If we had that ask from the department.
Explain that. I don't know if they know what you're talking about. A statewide amendment that until they get an RMP that recognizes migration corridors, that they stop them, or
yeah, President Salmi. Right now, what we've been talking a lot about is the problem, because we can't do an NSO stipulation, is because the Rock Springs plan hasn't been finalized, because that's in draft stage. So we have all these other field offices. We have Rollins, we have Pinedale, we have Kemmer. They all have existing RMPs. None of those RMPs account for the new data. They won't allow for when there's a migration designated, for that being acknowledged in the plan, and then provide this proper stipulations in place. So that's why we need to update. We need to do a statewide amendment to allow for that to happen.
What would the statewide amendment, what would you recommend that the BLM do?
I would say the department, the commission could just ask the BLM and Department of Interior to do that. It was made very specific in the secretary order that was a responsibility for them to do. In 180 days, they were supposed to update all manuals and existing regulations to be consistent with the requirements of the order that I'm talking about, the Secretary Order on Migration and Winter Range.
Okay, you've got that Secretary Order and that other handout. It's about the 4th page. It's got that Secretary Order 3362. So what part are you referring to?
It's Part D, number 1.
D as in David?
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know.
It's kind of
Under what section is it?
One of the last pages, one of the last sections, I believe.
What, D? It's the next to last page on D. I further to director.
So basically, the Secretary orders saying that the problem is nothing's happened to date in terms of having the BLM take action. And I called a lot of the BLM field staff last week from Kemmer, from Pinedale, from Rollins, and all the staff I talked to agreed with the BLM needing to do something statewide. It could be an internal instructional memorandum to begin with before the amendment. The amendment's probably going to take a while, but that could be something that's immediate. If the department and the commission ask for it, they can move forward, and then you'll have the tools, the best tools available to get this right. And that's what we're really asking, is to do this right.
Mr. President, Nick, when was the secretarial order issued?
That was back in February, so it's been over
180 days to update their rules, and no district in Wyoming has done it, right?
That's correct.
And the BLM in Rock Springs has been working on RMP for what, 10 years?
Something like that, yeah.
I mean, I don't mind asking, but it's not the solution. We have to make decisions today. If we sit around and wait for the federal government to act, we'll still be sitting around 10 years from now. I mean, I understand your argument, and I don't think the commission has any problem with asking them to do their job, but I mean, Zinke ordered them to do this in February, and it's now mid-November, and it's not done.
President Salmi, Commissioner Crank, I think they keep saying they want to defer to the state. So if the state, if the state shows that action that we want that done, I believe that will kick it in. It would be a catalyst to make it happen. I think they can continue to say that they're going to listen to everything the state requests.
I've seen letters from legislators asking them to complete the Rock Springs RMP. I think the governor's office has asked them to complete the RMP.
I guess to this issue, though, if there's a little bit of murkiness, if it's asked by the department and the commission to defer these leases, that they would do it. You saw how responsive they were to Parcel 307. I think if you guys ask, they'll do it. To defer all these leases.
I mean, the only one that gets kicked in the head over that deal is us, because we're the ones that are stepping out and saying, defer all these leases until the BLM does its job, until we spend another 10 years investigating, researching migration corridors, and the only one that gets killed with that is this commission and this department, because the legislature steps in and tries to take our discretion away on these important wildlife issues. That's the problem with that argument.
President Salmi, Commissioner Crank, I think the science speaks for itself. You guys heard from the lead scientist on this issue that basically we should be deferring until we have the proper ability to put the no surface occupancy in place because of what we've seen over the years.
Well, I didn't hear that from Hall Sawyer. I'm sorry, Nick.
No, you're correct. I'm sorry. What we've heard is the disturbance. What causes the disturbance, the energy development and the impacts to that. So what I'm saying, in my words, is that we need to get that right. And thank you for correcting me. I don't want to put words in Hall's mouth. But going back to the stopover areas where we're leasing and stopover areas, I think that's one example where it shouldn't be a question that we should be asking for deferral in stopover areas. And that not only that, with the avoidance level we've seen, that we should be asking for a buffer of 900 meters as well, not NSO with the 900 meter buffer. I think is appropriate for stopover areas and bottlenecks. Back 2 years ago when you guys took this issue up, half a mile buffer was on the table and that got removed. It was based on the science that was presented, was a half mile buffer. So what we're asking, I guess, what I'm asking is to go back and base the decisions on the best available science. That's what I have. I guess just to get away from the policy and the science for a little bit. I mean, you guys, everybody knows here is that in Wyoming we're extremely fortunate for having our abundant wildlife and these migrations. I just don't want to. I think President Al-Sami said it best in the last commission meeting, that we don't want to look back in 10 years and know that we jeopardized our ability to conserve our wildlife in this migration areas. So that's what I got. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Is there any questions?
Any questions? Oh, thank you, Nick. Joy Bannon.
Commission President, Director, members of the Commission. My name is Joy Bannon. I'm Policy Director for the Wyoming Wildlife Federation. I'm going to be pretty basic today. I'm here to talk about migration corridors. As oil and gas leases are nominated within these vital habitats, what are the next steps? The Federation would like to see these parcels deferred until a statewide set of management prescriptions or STIPs can be created and that are based on science. Using tools such as what was presented today in Hall's presentation. As you know, Wyoming has long worked to balance wildlife and our natural resource extractive industries. In order to aid in this balancing act, we suggest deferring these leases until this set of criteria can be developed before parcels are haphazardly leased in these vital ungulate habitats. So when these lease sales continue throughout the next year, we suggest deferral. In the meantime, develop a science-based set of prescriptions that ultimately work to avoid reducing the functionality of these corridors. The BLM is working on a stipulation for migration corridors now, as they've noted in a meeting that we just had with the governor's office and a variety of stakeholders about 4 weeks ago now. With that, the Department of Interior has its secretarial order 3362 focused on big game, crucial winter range, and migration corridors. It would be a suggestion of the Federation that the department, Wyoming Game and Fish Department, work with the BLM to formulate a memorandum of understanding to define a process specific to migration corridors so that when oil and gas lease sales are popping up, that there is an actual process in place between the department and the BLM on how they're going to work with each other, with how these are going to be either not be developed or what stipulations are going to be in place for those parcels. We just basically need a regulatory certainty. We hear that from the industry. We also need it on the conservation side. Basically, there's a need for getting this right, as we talked about before, pushing the pause button, as was noted in Du Bois. There's, yes, been time that has been taken for the Rock Springs RMP. There's time that's been taken to, look at these oil and gas leases. I think it's important to avoid reducing our ungulate populations, getting it right, and really taking the time to put together proper management before just haphazardly okaying parcels, and which ultimately could mean development in high-use corridor areas, and we do not want that. So thank you for your time today.
I'd have to correct you. I don't think that they've haphazardly approved these. I take issue with that. I think that the department has worked very hard on this, and I think we all have the best interests of the deer at heart. So
yes, I concur with that. I just mean that how they're nominated, and then if we're just allowing certain parcels to be okayed in in a notice that isn't based on science, just taking a little bit more time and getting that right.
Thank you.
No offense, I think the department is very dedicated, absolutely.
Thank you. All right, come on, we've all been waiting for Lisa McGee.
The cleanup hitter.
Yeah.
Closer. President Anselmi, Director Talbot, Commissioners, thanks so much for having such a robust series of presentations today about this important topic as a continuation of the discussion in Du Bois. And thanks for everybody who testified before me. I think how we ended the meeting in Du Bois.
Let's end this meeting, okay?
Yeah. Well, what I'm saying is I think we got to a very similar point where in the back and forth between the commission and Scott Smith, the commission seemed to think that you were in lockstep with what the department was trying to do, that what you were saying about protecting corridors is exactly what the department wants to do. And I think the intention is the same. But the way to get there is drastically different, and the tools that we allow ourselves to have are not the same. So if we all agree we want to protect corridors, let's give ourselves and the BLM ultimately the tools to make sure the corridors are protected. And right now, I want to talk about the 90% for just a minute. In the handout I gave, number 7, on this quick facts, I think I would take issue with the notion that as long as we have 10% outside the corridor, everything's going to be just fine. And I take issue with that for 2 reasons. The first is that it relies on a hope that a company will work with the local biologists and the local game and fish, local BLM employees. And second, in making that 10% decision, doesn't seem to me at this stage any reality check has been done about what stipulations currently overlay that 10%. So an example would be you have 90% of the corridor, 90% of the parcel in the corridor, 10% outside. That 10% outside might be overlaid with historic trails that require a buffer of no development. It might include sage grouse stipulations. It might include no surface occupancy stipulations because of steep slopes or sandy soils. And so it could be in that on-site visit that we keep hearing about that all the local people meet, and the operator, even if it intends to do the right thing, is constrained because stipulations are actually enforceable. Even if they wanted to put a well pad in the 10%, they can't, and so they're forced inside the corridor.
So do you know that's factually the case?
Yes, we've run maps. We can send them to you. The numbers?
Yeah, not today, but if there are leases where we did not request deferral and the 10% outside is unrollable for some reason, I'd like to see that.
Commissioner, I don't have those lease numbers in the front of my mind, but we've run a couple of what we call tabletop exercises with GIS, and there are a couple astounding examples where the 10% doesn't work.
That'd be great if you could give us
I'd be happy to share.
Today, but
thanks. The other thing I'll mention, which is another thing Scott Smith said, is that the choice the department was faced with was either a lease notice or waiting for an RMP amendment to be created. And really there's a third option, which is what everybody who's been up to this podium has asked for, and that third option is lease deferral. There's nothing that says we absolutely have to go forward with leasing. We're talking about a minuscule number of parcels, less than 8% of almost 800,000 acres that will be offered in February. And we're not saying that those might never be developed. We're saying that we'd like to get those right by deferring the parcels until a stipulation can be created. So it's not a matter of we're between a rock and a hard place, between a notice and waiting years for the Rock Springs field office to finish its RMP. There's this middle road that just gives us a little bit of breathing room.
That is what?
Lease deferral.
On everything that touches the corridor, not every lease out in that desert, but just the ones that touch the corridor. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Because I think there has been I think some people thought you were wanting to defer every lease out there in the desert.
No, and I don't even know if 5% of a lease that's 2,000 acres, if 5% of that parcel is within a corridor, whether deferral in that example is even necessary. I think we would ask the department to sit down with BLM and see what existing stipulations exist on those parcels first, and see if there's plenty of opportunity outside. So I don't know if, I mean, I hear you say, Commissioner Crank, if even a tiny bit touches the corridor. And I'm not wanting to draw a hard and fast line, but I do think that that attention to especially the high use areas, if it's true, and I think it is in a couple examples, that the 10% does not work on the ground, and some of those parcels are adjacent to high use or stopover areas, we haven't done enough. We haven't actually taken the steps to make sure the corridor is protected. And in closing, again, reminding everybody that this is a tiny acreage in relation to an otherwise huge lease sale, less than 8%. Just last week and a half ago, November 2nd, the BLM in Colorado deferred 58 parcels, including almost 75,000 acres from the upcoming lease sale in Colorado that contained big game habitat. And they did that in cooperation with a request from the state of Colorado to delay leasing to allow consideration of further habitat protections. I think, as a few others noted, several of us were in Cheyenne a few weeks ago, convened by the governor's staff to talk about this issue and chart a path forward. And I haven't seen all of the input from all the various stakeholders. I think there were 60 of us invited. But we recommended deferral and then some kind of expedited task force where stakeholders could come together with a science advisory panel. We could do it within less than a year. We could probably do it before the RMP is finalized, but it would be a statewide amendment like Nick talked about.
You're like a Sigit, but for deer, is that what you're saying?
That's right. And the only way we can do that is if we give ourselves some breathing room, and that is deferral. And in the letter I included in the packet to Mike McGrady, I also noted all the ways that this administration has said it wants to defer to the state and leave wildlife management decisions in the hands of the state. So really it's a question of whether there's political will for this commission and the department to work with the governor to make that ask.
So summarize in 25 words or less. What are you saying? Please.
President Anselmi, I am asking the commission to ask the department, to ask the BLM for deferral of leases in the upcoming lease sale that implicate crucial winter range or corridor areas for mule deer.
Defer that.
Define.
Affects corridor, does it touching? I mean, there are those, there are NGOs out there and other environmental groups that are saying if it in any way touches the corridor, push the pause button, stop, to request deferral. So, define it for us.
Well, the most conservative approach would be that if any portion of the lease parcel touches the corridor, you would defer it. I think there's something probably less conservative but better than what we're dealing with now that would also be satisfactory. And I think all of us in this room would help the department figure out what that definition is. I guess I would ask the commission, what's the downside, or why wouldn't the department do just what Colorado did just a week and a half ago? Why wouldn't we want to take the precautionary principle?
Mr. President, I think Pat touched on it a while ago. Politics in Wyoming and Colorado are very different. Wyoming's very dependent on the extraction industry, and there are legislators that are very friendly to that. We've got a hammer, but it's a very fragile hammer. If we overuse it, then we're going to lose our seat at the table. What the department and the commission have done is within the bounds of what we think we can do to protect the wildlife without overstepping and hurting our standing.
Our credibility, you know, and I'd add our credibility and our statutory authority.
One of the things that the folks here don't see is, you know, we have the environmental groups here presenting one side, and then we go home and we get hammered by the other side. And I kind of wish they were here to present their side so everybody could see both sides of this issue and not just one side of it.
But, I'm sorry,
No,
Lisa.
please.
But what is our job? That's the question for me. Our job is to conserve wildlife, protect wildlife. That's what this commission is supposed to be doing. It shouldn't matter, in my opinion, what the Petroleum Association would want. Our job, and what we're trying to accomplish, is to protect wildlife and what's best for wildlife.
But I think we have to work with them and have some agreement in the middle to get it done. They don't have to do what we ask.
They don't. I mean, we've got a great example northwest of Green River, Wyoming with that solar project. Game and Fish made a recommendation on that. The solar project is being built. You know, we're charged with protecting and conserving wildlife, but yet when it gets right down to it, we're somewhat of a toothless tiger when it comes to things like that, in my opinion.
Mr. President and Commissioner Smith, you know, I think there's a way to protect wildlife, and I absolutely agree with you. That's our mission. But the request from NGOs to object to any oil and gas lease that in any way touches a migration corridor, it goes too far.
And I agree with that. We have the corridor identified. Those boundaries are identified. If it touches it, as long as that activity is outside of that boundary, I don't personally have a problem with that. My concern is inside that corridor.
The other thing I resent is the BLM running around and telling everybody that we'll do whatever the hell the state asks. I mean, that's not my experience. I have scars all over my head asking them to federal agencies to delist wolves, to delist grizzly bears, to not treat Wyoming like a third world colony like they do in many instances. So, I'm sorry.
Is there something short, Commissioner Crank, of what you think we're asking for that you might do that's a step beyond the strategy right now?
I want to get this right so we can carefully analyze every lease. Like I said a minute ago, this is not complicated to me. Maybe I'm just thinking of it too simply, and I think Commissioner Smith agrees with me.
I agree.
Look at every one of these leases. That's why I ask, you know, if we have leases we didn't object to where there's something that would prevent that oil company from drilling outside the corridor, then we need to know about that, because the reason I want to know about it is so we can avoid that mistake in the future. If we're not looking at all the data out there, which is kind of what I heard from Hall Sawyer, I think there's more overlays and data we can look at to make better decisions. But you know, at the end of the day, we need to look at every lease, object or not object, defer or not defer. But to just say we're going to wait on the federal government until they do a statewide amendment, you know, if it took them 10 years and they still haven't completed the Rock Springs RMP, how long is it going to take them to do a statewide amendment? We can ask for it, and that's a legitimate request, but to just say we're going to stop and we're not going to make a recommendation, I think is inconsistent with protecting wildlife. I think we need to make recommendations, but figure out how to do it exactly right. And I'll tell you, I mean, you know, I think you're being the most reasonable of the NGOs who have appeared in front of us, and you're offering solutions and thoughts and ideas. That's awesome. I mean, let's work together and figure this out so we can do it better. But just to, you know, ask for deferral like they did in Colorado, I agree with Commissioner Culver. It's a much different political world.
If we don't ask for deferral, though, we lose the opportunity to make sure we get it right. So
It's not perfect. I mean, I'm sorry.
it isn't, but if we have the opportunity to give ourselves a little bit of time, and deferral buys us that time.
But what you're not listening to, I don't think, is to just object to ask for every oil and gas lease that in any way touches a migration corridor. I think destroys our credibility, causes us great grief with the legislature that is very pro-oil and gas. And
I understand
personally,
that.
I don't think that's a risk that this commission should take.
I understand that. I would argue, however, that the 90%, 10%, especially when we've run some of these maps that show that at the APD stage, that's going to be unworkable, and promises made to this commission and to the public that we're going to protect corridors because we have this 90% rule. The homework hasn't been done.
That's the first time we heard that was today.
Well, it's because a lot of us, I mean, we're scrambling. We've just come up, we've said, how does this 90% rule work? Is that going to be okay with the existing stipulations on the ground today or existing development? And we try to run some of those maps, and we're still trying to do that. I would argue the department should have done that before it said it was okay to lease a couple of those parcels.
You're right, but help us do it right.
I would,
mean, if you have those examples, supply them.
I would be happy to. And we do have a little bit more time. I mean, that's the good news. We don't have a lease sale in December. It's not until February. So if we provide you with some analysis of some fourth quarter parcels that we can show don't actually work or likely won't work with the 90%, would the commission and the department think again about deferring those discrete parcels?
That's what we've said. We're going to look at every lease
on a case-by-case basis.
Best decision on a case-by-case basis on the best science available. So if the 10% doesn't work, I would hope the department would defer it, and I believe they will.
Could the department help us do those tabletop exercises, or is it on the public to do that? I mean, I have an intern that I would like to hire to run some of these maps, but you are a whole state agency, and it would be great to have your support in doing those exercises so that we know we have all the same layers and we're all on the same page.
Well, sit down with Scott and figure out how to do it together for the next lease sale. If you have evidence that we screwed up before, show us that so we know what we're looking for, but do it together going forward.
Is that all right with you, Mr. Smith?
Sounds good.
I know it would be. Thank you very much. And I appreciate your work, Angie. Thank you. This is.
Are we?
No, I'm enjoying this. Thank you.
For it.
Thank you. I don't know what to do with Ian Tater. I don't know why you always get at the end of the list. This happened before. I got to talk to Kennedy how he sets this thing up, because he always puts this stuff at the end. It should be towards the front. Because do we want to give me a suggestion here?
My suggestion, considering the fact that we have some sponsors who have a open house that started 10 minutes ago and we have to get on the other side of town, would be to postpone the next two agenda items until tomorrow and go join our hosts, the Mule Fanatics, for tonight and start over again in the morning at 7 o'clock for executive session, and then begin the agenda with these items or work those items in tomorrow, Mr. President.
I agree with that. That's what we'll do. Any other questions or comments?
Call to the public.
Call the public? Holy mackerel. Thank you. See you tomorrow.